The cabin was small and unassuming, nestled deep within the woods of upstate New York. It had been John Crow's idea to take the trip, though he hadn't expected his friends to actually agree. After years of serving in the Army, John had developed a fondness for quiet places, somewhere he could put out the constant thrum of chaos. And these woods, with their canopy of autumn leaves and crisp, cool air, seemed the perfect getaway. His friends, Mark, a computer programmer, Sarah, an avid outdoors woman, and Ethan, the life of the party, had all joined him. They'd driven up from different corners of the country, converging in this remote spot for a much-needed break. The weather was cloudy when they arrived, a faint gray haze diffusing the sunlight, adding an eerie cast to the surrounding forest. John had spent his childhood in Mississippi, where he'd learned how to hunt, fish, and move quietly through the woods. Those lessons felt distant now, but they lingered in his muscle memory, surfacing every so often as a quiet confidence when he navigated unfamiliar terrain. The first day passed uneventfully. They unpacked supplies, cooked over an old wood stove, and laughed around a small fire they built outside. John enjoyed the camaraderie, even as a nagging unease took root in his gut. The woods were too quiet. He'd been in places like this before, dense and sprawling, where danger could slip between the trees without a sound. It was on the second evening that everything changed. They'd gone hiking earlier in the day, exploring a narrow trail that twisted deeper into the forest. By the time they returned to the cabin, the clouds had thickened, casting the woods into premature dusk. Ethan suggested another fire, and they all agreed. As the flames flickered, John caught himself glancing over his shoulder more than once. It wasn't just the quiet now. There was a sense of being watched, an almost tangible presence just beyond the light. He said nothing, not wanting to spook the others. Then they heard it, a faint rustling just beyond the tree line. Probably an animal, Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. John stood, his hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife strapped to his belt. "Stay here," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He moved toward the sound, his footsteps deliberate and silent on the soft forest floor. The rustling stopped. John scanned the trees, his senses sharp. At first he saw nothing, but then his eyes locked onto something. A shape, tall and thin, partially obscured by the trunk of a large oak. It wasn't an animal. Its silhouette was human-like, but wrong. The limbs were too long, the proportions off, as if someone had stretched a person like taffy. "Who's there?" John called, his voice steady. The figure didn't move, but he could feel its gaze. The air seemed to thicken, and a chill ran down his spine. He stepped back, his instincts screaming at him to retreat. "Get inside," he said as he reached the others. "What was it?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide. "I don't know," John admitted. He wasn't one to scare easily, but there was something deeply unsettling about that figure. The rest of the night was tense. They stayed by the fire, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. At one point, Mark swore he saw movement in the shadows, but when John shone a flashlight, there was nothing there. They heard the first scream just before dawn. It came from the woods, a high-pitched, guttural sound that sent a shiver through them all. Before they could react, the creature lunged from the darkness, its pale form illuminated briefly by the firelight. It moved with unnatural speed, swiping at Ethan and knocking him to the ground. John sprang into action, slashing at the creature with his knife. It recoiled, emitting a sound that was more growl than scream before disappearing into the trees. "Ethan's hurt," Sarah said, kneeling beside him. His arm was bleeding, the wound deep but not life-threatening. "We need to move," John said. "It's not going to stop." They gathered what they could carry and left the cabin, sticking close together as they moved through the forest. John took the lead, his senses on high alert. The clouds above blocked out the moonlight, making it difficult to see. Every so often, John caught a glimpse of the creature, just a flicker of movement in the corner of his vision. It was stalking them, staying just far enough away to avoid another confrontation. They didn't stop, not even when Ethan stumbled and nearly fell. John's training kicked in, keeping him focused on the goal, the nearby village they'd passed on their way to the cabin. It was miles away, but It was their only chance. The creature attacked again when they were halfway there. This time, it targeted Mark, slashing at his back before John managed to drive it off. Mark could still walk, but barely. They finally emerged from the woods just as dawn broke, the village's small collection of houses visible in the distance. The creature didn't follow them out of the forest, stopping at the edge of the trees and watching as they stumbled into safety. The villagers didn't believe their story. They chalked it up to a bear attack and warned them not to venture into the woods again. John didn't argue. He'd seen enough to know that what they encountered wasn't a bear. It wasn't human either. As they sat in a diner later that morning, nursing cups of coffee and trying to process what had happened, John's thoughts drifted to his family. His father had always told him stories about creatures that lived in the wild, but he'd never believed them. Now he wasn't so sure. The drive through Montana in winter was a sight to behold. Wide open plains cloaked in white, mountains rising in the distance like watchful sentinels. Nick Calhoun had always loved fishing, and when the opportunity arose to take a trip to one of the state's famed rivers, he hadn't hesitated. Winter wasn't the typical season for fishing, but he liked the quiet it brought. Fewer people, fewer distractions. Just the sound of the river and the cold air biting at his face. Nick was from Austin, where the winters were milder and life never seemed to stop moving. He worked as an IT specialist, glued to a desk most days, troubleshooting systems for clients who didn't understand technology but demanded its flawless operation. This trip was a break from the screens and the endless buzz of the city. The cabin he rented was on the edge of a wooded area, with the river just a short walk away. Snow blanketed everything, muffling sound and creating an almost otherworldly stillness. Nick spent the first day setting up, organizing his gear, and testing the frozen waters. The fish were sluggish but catchable. That night, as he sat by the fire outside the cabin, he couldn't shake a strange feeling, like he wasn't alone. The woods seemed darker than they should have been, the shadows deeper and more oppressive. He tried to brush it off as paranoia. After all, he'd read about the region's folklore, its tales of strange creatures lurking in the wilderness. Skinwalkers, the legends called them. Shapeshifters that mimicked voices and wore the faces of things they weren't. He'd chalked it up to local superstition, the kind of thing people told around campfires. But then he heard the sound. At first it was faint, a rustling in the trees, like an animal moving through the underbrush. Nick tensed, his grip tightening on the flashlight in his hand. The rustling grew louder, closer. He shone the beam toward the noise, but it revealed nothing but swaying branches. Then came the cry. It was high-pitched and guttural, like a scream that didn't belong to any animal he'd ever heard. It echoed through the forest, sending a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Nick backed toward the cabin, his eyes scanning the woods for movement. Probably a wolf, he muttered to himself, though he didn't believe it. Wolves didn't scream like that. The next day, he returned to the river. The sun was hidden behind a thick layer of gray clouds, and snow began to fall in soft, steady flakes. He couldn't shake the unease from the night before, but he pushed through it. The water was cold enough to sting his fingers, and the fish were more elusive than the day prior. As he worked, he felt it again, that sense of being watched. He turned sharply, scanning the tree line. For a moment, he saw nothing, but then his eyes locked onto something, a figure partially hidden behind a tree. It looked human, but there was something wrong about it. Its limbs were too thin, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Nick froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Hey," he called, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. Nick grabbed his fishing knife, his pulse pounding in his ears. The figure stepped out from behind the tree, revealing its full form. It was tall and gaunt, its skin pale and stretched tightly over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to suck in the light around them. Nick didn't wait to see what it would do. He bolted for the cabin, his boots crunching through the snow. He could hear it following him, its footsteps unnaturally fast, closing the distance with every second. He slammed the door shut behind him, locking it and shoving a chair under the knob for good measure. The creature screamed again, the sound reverberating through the cabin walls. That night was hell. Nick stayed awake by the fire, clutching his knife and listening to the creature's movements outside. It circled the cabin, its heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. Occasionally it scratched at the walls, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. He thought of his family, his dad, who had taught him how to fish, and his mom, who always packed him extra food for his trips, saying, "Just in case." He wished he'd called them before he'd left, just to hear their voices. As the hours dragged on, Nick formulated a plan. He couldn't stay here. He had to make a run for it. There was a small town a few miles away. If he could make it there, he'd be safe. At first light, he packed his gear as quietly as possible, not wanting to alert the creature. The snow was still falling, muffling his footsteps as he slipped out the back door. The woods were eerily silent. Nick moved quickly but cautiously, his knife at the ready. He could see tracks in the snow, long, narrow prints that didn't belong to any animal he recognized. He didn't make it far before the creature attacked. It came out of nowhere, its skeletal form lunging at him with a guttural growl. Nick managed to slash at it with his knife, the blade slicing into its arm. It screamed, a horrible, unearthly sound, and retreated into the trees. Nick didn't stop. He ran, his legs burning and his lungs aching from the cold air. The town was closer now, the faint outlines of buildings visible through the trees. When he finally stumbled into the town, he collapsed on the steps of a diner. The locals rushed to help him, their faces a mix of concern and disbelief as he tried to explain what had happened. The police didn't believe him, of course. They said it was probably a bear or a coyote, but Nick knew better. He'd seen the creature, heard it scream. As he sat in the warmth of the diner, nursing a cup of coffee and trying to steady his hands, he thought about the stories he'd read. They weren't just folklore. Some things in the woods were real. The sun hung low in the clear winter sky as Viggo Davidson adjusted his jacket, stepping out of the car to inspect the situation. The engine had sputtered one last protest before falling silent, and now the vehicle was as lifeless as the frosty landscape surrounding them. The road stretched out in both directions, bordered by dense Maine woods cloaked in snow. It had been sunny earlier in the day, the brightness reflecting off the endless white, but now shadows crept long and sharp as the afternoon waned. Viggo's breath plumed in front of him as he leaned under the hood. "Looks like we're stuck," he said, his tones steady but inwardly calculating. As a soldier, Viggo had been in far worse predicaments, but there was something unsettling about being stranded in the middle of nowhere with night coming on. He glanced back at his companions. Jenna, the sharp-witted engineer, Craig, an overly optimistic college buddy who'd convinced them to take the scenic route, and Leah, Craig's younger sister, quieter but practical. They all stood bundled against the cold, looking at him for answers. "We're not getting this running without parts," Viggo said finally, shutting the hood with a soft thud. "Can we call for help?" Leah asked. "No signal," Jenna said, holding up her phone. "We're officially off the grid." "Well, we could wait it out," Craig suggested. "The weather's clear. Someone's bound to drive by." "Not likely on this road," Viggo replied, scanning the tree line. "And we don't have time to waste before dark. Let's find somewhere to hunker down." The group gathered their essentials, flashlights, blankets, some food, and headed into the woods. Viggo's gaze lingered on the car for a moment. Something about the quietness of the area felt wrong, as if the silence wasn't natural but imposed. They walked for nearly an hour before they found a small clearing. In its center stood the remnants of an old hunting cabin, weathered but sturdy enough to provide some shelter. By nightfall, they had a fire going in the cabin's crumbling stone fireplace. The warmth was a relief, but the isolation of the woods pressed in on them. Shadows flickered across the walls, and the wind carried faint creaks and rustles that set everyone on edge. Viggo sat close to the fire, sharpening the blade of his pocket knife. His mind wandered to his family back in Texas. He thought of his younger brother, whose antics always brought laughter to the house, and his mother, who'd raised him with a grit that had carried him through countless challenges. She always said, "You're tougher than the worst of it." He repeated that to himself now. The first sound came just after midnight. It was faint at first, a shuffle of movement outside the cabin. Viggo's hands stilled and he glanced at the others. Jenna had heard it too, her eyes darting toward the door. Craig was about to speak when a sharp, deliberate scratching noise echoed against the wall. Leah gasped, clutching her blanket tighter. Viggo motioned for silence, rising slowly to peer out a crack in the door. The moon cast an eerie glow across the snowy clearing, but nothing moved. Just trees and shadows. Yet, the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. "Anything?" Jenna whispered. Viggo shook his head but kept his voice low. "Stay close to the fire." Hours later, as the fire dwindled, Viggo sat watch while the others dozed fitfully. That's when he saw it. Movement just beyond the tree line. His muscles tensed as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. The figure was humanoid, but its posture was hunched, its limbs unnaturally long. It stood half concealed behind a tree, the faint glint of eyes catching the moonlight as it stared back at him. Viggo's pulse quickened. He'd read about this in his research, reports of a creature in Maine matching the descriptions of a werewolf. Hunters and hikers whispered of a beast that was neither man nor wolf, capable of intelligence and malice in equal measure. He didn't wake the others, not yet. Instead, he watched, his grip tightening on the knife. The figure moved again, slinking around the edge of the clearing. It wasn't coming closer, just circling, waiting. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the figure disappeared. Viggo woke the group, explaining what he'd seen without elaborating too much. They packed quickly, their breath fogging in the frigid air as they trudged back toward the road. They didn't make it far before the attack came. It happened fast, a blur of movement, a guttural snarl, and Craig was knocked to the ground. Viggo reacted instantly, slashing at the creature with his knife. It was fast and strong, its claws raking across his arm before retreating into the woods. Craig was injured but alive, his leg bleeding badly. Viggo hoisted him up, adrenaline dulling his own pain. They moved as quickly as they could, fear propelling them through the woods. Every sound set them on edge, the crunch of snow, the snap of a branch. The creature was following them, its growls echoing just out of sight. By the time they reached the main road, the sun was high in the sky. Viggo waved down the first vehicle they saw, a truck driver who didn't ask many questions as he helped them load Craig in the back. They never called the police. What would they say? That a werewolf had attacked them in the woods? No one would believe it. As they drove toward the nearest town, Viggo stared out the window, his arm bandaged with a strip of his jacket. The memory of those hollow eyes and that deliberate stalking would stay with him forever. Somewhere deep in the Maine woods, the creature still waited. The late summer wind rustled through the dense canopy of Wisconsin's northern woods, carrying with it the mingling scents of pine needles, damp earth, and wildflowers. David Russell sat by the flickering campfire, a rifle leaning against his chair. The flames cast dancing shadows against the surrounding trees, and despite the warmth of the fire, a cool unease had settled in his chest. He wasn't a stranger to nights like this. Back in San Francisco, where he worked as a park ranger, his nights often brought challenges, lost hikers, unexpected wildlife encounters, and the occasional reckless camper needing a stern word. But this was different. These woods were unfamiliar, vast, and old. Their silence seemed deliberate, as if holding back something lurking just beyond his senses. His hunting partner, Sean, was seated across from him, carefully cleaning his shotgun. Sean was local to Wisconsin and had invited David to join him for a few days of hunting to get away from it all. David had welcomed the opportunity, relishing the idea of solitude after months of tourists crowding the California parks. The first 2 nights had been uneventful. They'd tracked deer, fished in the nearby stream, and swapped stories over the fire. But the wind had picked up tonight, carrying an eerie howl that seemed to echo unnaturally through the trees. David's mind flickered to an article he'd read in Wilderness Monthly about cryptid sightings in the Midwest, werewolves specifically. He'd dismissed it as folklore, the kind of thing that made for good campfire tales. Still, as the howls grew louder, a tingle of unease crawled up his spine. "You hear that?" David asked, keeping his voice low. Sean nodded, setting his shotgun aside. "Could be wolves, but it's off. Too guttural." The sound came again, closer this time. A low, rumbling growl followed, vibrating through the ground beneath them. Sean cursed under his breath, grabbing a flashlight and scanning the tree line. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating swaying branches and shadows, but nothing tangible. David stood, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of the hunting knife strapped to his belt. The fire popped loudly, and for a moment he thought he saw a pair of reflective eyes glinting from the darkness. "Sean," he said, his voice tight. "We're not alone." The growl came again, this time from the opposite direction. Whatever it was circling them. Sean turned the flashlight in a slow arc, his finger hovering near the trigger of his shotgun. "Stay close," he muttered. Minutes stretched into eternity as the two men stood back to back near the fire. The wind howled through the trees, masking other sounds. When it came, the attack was sudden. A dark, massive shape lunged from the shadows, knocking Sean to the ground. David barely had time to react, raising his rifle and firing a shot that missed but startled the creature enough to retreat into the trees. It moved too fast to make out clearly, but David caught glimpses of matted fur and elongated limbs. "Sean!" he shouted, rushing to his friend's side. Sean groaned, clutching his arm, which now bore deep gashes. "Thing's huge," Sean gasped, wincing as David helped him sit up. "We needed to get out of here," David said firmly. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows as the wind threatened to snuff it out. They quickly doused the flames, leaving only their flashlights to guide them through the dense forest. David took the lead, gripping his rifle tightly while Sean limped behind him, his shotgun slung over his good shoulder. The wind carried faint growls and the occasional snapping of branches, signaling that the creature was still following them. "We can't outrun it," Sean panted, David's jaw tightened. "We don't have to. We just need to get to the car." The trail back to their vehicle was narrow and uneven, with roots and rocks jutting out like traps. Every so often, David would glance back, his flashlight cutting through the trees, but he saw nothing. The creature was clever, keeping its distance while maintaining its relentless pursuit. When they finally reached the clearing where the car was parked, David felt a flicker of relief, but as they approached, the creature emerged from the shadows, blocking their path. It stood upright, towering over them, its yellow eyes glowing with malevolent intelligence. Its snout was elongated, lips curling back to reveal sharp, glistening teeth. David didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired. The creature let out an ear-piercing roar but didn't go down. It charged, its claws swiping through the air. Sean fired his shotgun, and this time, the creature staggered, giving them the opening they needed. "Go!" David shouted, dragging Sean toward the car. They threw themselves inside, locking the doors just as the creature slammed against the side of the vehicle. The car rocked violently, and David fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. "Come on! Come on!" Sean yelled. The engine roared to life, and David floored the gas pedal. The car skidded across the snowy ground before gaining traction, speeding away from the clearing. In the rearview mirror, David saw the creature watching them, its silhouette growing smaller until it disappeared entirely into the forest. They didn't stop until they reached a nearby town. Sean was taken to the local clinic for his injuries, and when the sheriff asked what had happened, they exchanged a glance before giving a vague story about a bear attack. David knew no one would believe the truth. Later that night, as he sat in the motel room, David couldn't shake the image of the creature's glowing eyes. He thought of his family back in San Francisco, his sister, who always teased him about his obsession with cryptid stories, and his father, who had instilled in him a respect for the wilderness. This trip had given him a new respect, a fear even, for the unknown. The forest in northern Maine had an unforgiving stillness to it, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that sent golden and russet leaves spiraling to the ground. Chuck Mortensen adjusted the strap of his backpack as he surveyed the surrounding trees, their skeletal branches stretching against the overcast sky. He wasn't used to this kind of autumn. Back in Los Angeles, where he worked as a park ranger in Griffith Park, fall usually meant a slight drop in temperature and a rare drizzle. Here, the crisp air bit at his cheeks, and the sheer vastness of the wilderness was overwhelming. He wasn't alone. His companions for this road trip, Ben, Kate, and Lucas, had insisted on seeing the famed foliage of New England. Chuck had joined them on a whim, craving a break from the smoggy skies and crowded trails of LA. They'd rented a cabin deep in the woods, a rustic place with creaky floorboards and a fireplace that smelled of decades-old ash. The first night passed uneventfully, the group laughing over ghost stories and beer around a roaring fire. Chuck had shared tales of his ranger duties, recounting strange noises in the park at night and the time he'd stumbled across a mountain lion too close for comfort. But nothing in his years of experience could explain what happened on the second night. The snow had started falling that afternoon, a light dusting that grew heavier as the evening wore on. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the world outside the cabin was a blank white canvas, the trees silhouetted against the pale glow of the moon. Chuck had been uneasy all day, though he couldn't put his finger on why. Something about the way the forest felt, like it was holding its breath. As the group huddled around the fireplace after dinner, the sound came. A low, guttural growl that reverberated through the walls of the cabin. "What the hell was that?" Ben asked, his voice a mixture of curiosity and fear. "Probably a coyote," Chuck said, though he didn't believe it. He had read about the creatures of this region, especially in an old wilderness magazine that detailed local legends. One article had mentioned the rougarou, a shape-shifting predator that prowled the dense forests of the Northeast. At the time, he dismissed it as folklore. Now, he wasn't so sure. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by a heavy thud against the side of the cabin. Kate screamed, clutching Lucas's arm as everyone froze. Chuck grabbed the hatchet he'd been using to split firewood earlier and motioned for the others to stay put. He crept to the window and peered out into the snow-covered darkness. At first, he saw nothing. But then, just beyond the tree line, movement caught his eye. A shadowy figure, unnaturally tall and hunched, slinking between the trees. "Chuck?" Kate's voice trembled. "It's something big," he said, not taking his eyes off the window. The figure stepped into the moonlight, and Chuck's breath caught. It looked vaguely human, but its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. Its face was obscured, but the way it moved made his skin crawl. Suddenly, the creature lunged forward, slamming into the side of the cabin with enough force to rattle the windows. The group scattered, grabbing whatever makeshift weapons they could find. Lucas armed himself with a hunting knife, while Ben clutched a cast-iron skillet. "Stay together," Chuck commanded, his ranger instincts kicking in. The creature prowled outside, its heavy footsteps crunching in the snow. They could hear it circling, a predator toying with its prey. "We can't stay here," Ben said, panic creeping into his voice. "No choice," Chuck said. "It's too dangerous to run in the dark. We wait for first light." The group retreated to the living room, stoking the fire and keeping their backs to the wall. Chuck kept watch, gripping the hatchet tightly, his eyes flicking to the boarded-up windows at every sound. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into eternity. Chuck's mind wandered to his family back in LA. His younger brother, who'd always begged him to go camping, and his mother, who'd insisted he carry a pocket Bible whenever he went into the wilderness. He wondered if she'd been onto something. When dawn finally broke, the snow had stopped, leaving a pristine, glittering blanket over the forest. The creature's growls had ceased hours ago, but Chuck wasn't naive enough to think it had left. "We move fast and stay quiet," he instructed as they prepared to leave. They packed only the essentials, leaving behind most of their gear to lighten the load. The group stepped outside, the cold biting at their exposed skin. The cabin felt like a fragile shield they were abandoning too soon. They hadn't gone more than 100 yards when the Rougarou struck. It burst from the trees with a blood-curdling roar, barreling toward them on all fours. Chuck shouted for the others to scatter, swinging his hatchet as the creature lunged at him. The blade connected, but it was like striking a boulder. Lucas tried to intervene, slashing at the beast with his knife, but the creature swiped him aside with a single blow. He hit the ground hard, unmoving. "Run!" Chuck yelled, grabbing Kate and Ben by the arms and dragging them forward. The next hour was a blur of terror and exhaustion as they navigated the snow-covered terrain. The creature stalked them relentlessly, its guttural growls echoing through the trees. When they finally saw the rooftops of a small village in the distance, relief washed over them. They sprinted the last stretch, stumbling into the first house they found. The elderly couple inside took them in without question, calling for help as they tended to their injuries. Lucas didn't make it. As Chuck sat in the warmth of the stranger's living room, sipping a cup of hot tea, he couldn't shake the image of the Rougarou's piercing eyes. He thought of the article he'd read, the warning signs he'd ignored. Legends, it seemed, had a way of proving themselves real when you least expected it. The woods around Bladenboro, North Carolina, had an eerie reputation. James Calhoun had heard the stories before, whispered around campfires and shared in small-town diners. People spoke of strange shadows in the trees, of unearthly noises that echoed in the dark, but those were just stories, or so he'd told himself. James, a police officer from a quiet Midwest town, had joined his friends, Tommy, Sarah, and Kyle, for a spring hiking trip in the Bladen Lake State Forest. It was meant to be a break from the grind, a chance to enjoy the flowering dogwoods and the faint buzz of spring insects. James had always liked hiking, a holdover from his childhood spent exploring the rolling hills near his home. The hike started off pleasantly enough. The air was cool and damp, the sky a slate gray from the thick clouds overhead. They followed a narrow trail that wound through the forest, the dense foliage muffling their voices and the sound of their boots crunching the underbrush. As they walked, James thought of his sister back home. She'd always teased him about his fascination with the outdoors, claiming he liked trees more than people. She wasn't entirely wrong. He preferred the quiet of the woods to the chaos of city life. By mid-afternoon, the group had reached a clearing and decided to rest. They built a small fire, its smoke curling into the cloudy sky. James watched the flames dance as Kyle pulled out a bag of trail mix. "You ever hear about the Beast of Bladenboro?" Kyle asked, grinning. He was always the one to bring up local legends. The more outlandish, the better. Sarah rolled her eyes. "Here we go again." "I'm serious," Kyle said. "Back in the 1950s, people reported this huge creature killing livestock. They said it was like a cross between a bear and a panther. Some folks even claimed it was a skinwalker." "Skinwalker?" Tommy frowned. "It's a Navajo legend," James said, surprising himself with the calmness of his tone. "Supposedly, it's a person who can transform into an animal. They're dangerous, though. Real bad news." "You believe in that stuff?" Sarah asked, raising an eyebrow. James shrugged. "I've heard stories. Doesn't mean I believe them. But it's always smart to keep your eyes open in places like this." Kyle snorted. "So what you're saying is, we should be on the lookout for werewolves and witches." The group laughed, but James couldn't shake the unease creeping into his gut. As they packed up their things and continued down the trail, the woods seemed to close in around them. The light grew dimmer, the shadows deeper. It wasn't until they came across the old oak tree that James saw it. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a dark shape crouched behind the thick trunk. But then it moved, slowly, deliberately. Two glinting eyes stared back at him, unblinking. "Guys," James said, his voice low. The others turned to look, their laughter fading. "What is that?" Sarah whispered. The figure didn't move closer. It just sat there, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its form was vaguely human, but distorted, too tall, too thin. "Back away," James said, keeping his voice steady. His hand instinctively went to the knife at his belt. They retreated slowly, their eyes never leaving the figure. As soon as they were out of sight, they broke into a run, their boots pounding the dirt trail. The creature didn't follow, but James could feel it watching, its presence like a weight pressing down on his chest. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, the forest was deathly silent. No birds, no insects, just the sound of their ragged breathing. "We need to get out of here," James said, his tone leaving no room for argument. But as they tried to retrace their steps, the trail seemed to shift. Familiar landmarks vanished, replaced by unfamiliar trees and twisted roots. It was as if the forest itself was working against them. Night fell quickly, the cloudy sky offering little light. They built another fire, more for comfort than warmth. James kept watch, his knife in hand. As the hours dragged on, the creature returned. It didn't attack, but circled them, its low growls rumbling in the darkness. The firelight caught glimpses of its shape, elongated limbs, a hunched back, and those piercing eyes. Kyle panicked, threw a rock into the trees. "Leave us alone," he shouted. The growls stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then, with a deafening crash, the creature slammed into Kyle, knocking him to the ground. James lunged forward, slashing at it with his knife. The blade connected, and the creature let out a guttural scream before retreating into the shadows. "Kyle!" Sarah cried, kneeling beside him. He was alive but bleeding badly, his arm mangled. "We can't stay here," James said, his voice shaking. With Kyle leaning heavily on Tommy, they pressed on, their pace agonizingly slow. James led the way, every nerve in his body screaming for him to run, to leave the others and save himself. But he couldn't do that. By dawn, they stumbled into the outskirts of a small town. A passing truck driver stopped to help, calling for an ambulance as Sarah explained what had happened. James didn't tell the driver about the creature. He didn't mention the way its eyes had seemed to bore into his soul, or the sound of its growl that still echoed in his ears. Some things were better left unsaid. As he sat in the back of the truck, watching the forest recede in the distance, he couldn't help but wonder if the stories were true after all. Maybe the woods held secrets too dark to uncover, and maybe some legends were meant to be believed. The Appalachian Mountains had always held a certain allure for George Johnson. Their rolling peaks, dense forests, and hidden trails called to him, offering an escape from the heat of Austin's concrete sprawl. As a delivery driver, his days were spent navigating city traffic and listening to the grumble of engines. Hiking was his reprieve, a silent contrast to the roar of his daily life. Spring brought the mountain laurel into bloom, and with it, George's yearning for solitude among the trees. He planned a hike that would take him deep into the forest, past streams that whispered secrets, and under a canopy thick with the scent of wet earth. The forecast called for clouds, but that suited him fine. It kept the sun's glare off his back and added a misty veil to the path ahead. It was on the third mile when the silence broke. A sharp, guttural snarl echoed from somewhere deep in the woods, the kind that seemed to resonate not just in his ears, but in his bones. George froze, fingers tightening around the handle of the hunting knife strapped to his side. His breath stilled, and he listened. The birds had gone quiet, the only sound now the rustle of leaves shifting in the breeze. A childhood spent camping with his father in the Texas hill country had given him a healthy respect for wild animals. But this noise was different, more deliberate. He swallowed, taking a step forward, only to hear the distinct crack of a branch breaking behind him. Whipping around, George's eyes scanned the forest, trying to pierce through the shifting shades of green and brown. That's when he saw it, a shadow too tall to be a deer, too broad to be a bear. It stood partially hidden behind an ancient oak, eyes glinting like polished coins. Dogman. The name came unbidden, a whisper from the corners of his mind, where campfire stories and online articles had lodged like splinters. Back in Austin, George had spent restless nights reading about cryptid sightings. Stories of strange creatures with canine features and the gait of a man haunted the rural corners of America, with sightings most often traced to dense, uncharted forests. The Dogman, a name repeated by both skeptics and believers, was described as feral, calculating, and fiercely territorial. The shadow didn't move, but its eyes tracked him as he slowly stepped backward, each movement deliberate, measured. The thudding of his heart filled his ears, a drumbeat urging him to flee. But he knew better. Running would only make him prey. By the time the light had started to wane, the clouds thickened, casting a dusky glow over the forest. George reached a clearing and decided it was safer to stay put rather than stumble blind through an unknown trail. He gathered dry twigs and branches, the snap of each one sounding like a gunshot in the quiet. Soon, a fire crackled to life, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance with the trees. He sat close, the knife resting beside him, his eyes darting from the fire to the darkness beyond. The wind picked up, whistling a mournful tune through the trees, and with it came the sound again, a low, guttural growl, this time circling the edge of the clearing. George's skin prickled, every instinct screaming that he wasn't alone. The fire's light caught movement, a flash of fur, a shift in the dark that resolved into a shape. It was hunched, its limbs grotesquely long, its snout raised as if tasting the air. Memories flooded him, his father's easy laughter, the warm glow of their family's old kitchen, the way his mother always kept a light on, just in case. He longed for that light now, something steady to anchor him against the shifting shadows. The creature let out a noise, half growl, half laughter, and George felt a shiver course down his spine. He gripped the knife tighter and, for a moment, considered the flare gun in his pack, a last resort. Time passed in a tense, surreal loop. The creature circled, its eyes never straying from him, yet it didn't attack. The wind began to chill, seeping into his bones as the night stretched on. George tried to think of anything but the glint of those eyes, or the way they seemed to follow the dancing light of the fire. Morning broke slowly, the gray light spreading through the trees, dispersing the shadows inch by inch. When George finally dared to move, stiff and aching from a night spent on high alert, the creature had gone, leaving behind only a faint impression in the damp earth where it had stood. He wasted no time packing up, his hands trembling as he doused the fire and secured his gear. The path out was rough, his boots catching on roots and stones as he stumbled forward. Every snap of a twig sent his pulse racing, but the forest remained silent, watchful. A few miles from the clearing, George reached a fork in the trail and spotted a narrow dirt road winding its way toward a village. Relief surged through him, almost bringing him to his knees. As he crossed into the open, the tension finally released its grip, leaving him exhausted and hollow. When he reached the town, he considered telling someone, calling the police maybe. But as he saw the faces of the locals, heard their easy chatter, he held back. What could he say that wouldn't sound like the ramblings of a madman? Instead, he sank onto a bench outside a general store, the weight of the night pressing down on him. As the first rays of the sun broke through the morning clouds, George looked back at the tree line. The forest, ancient and indifferent, seemed to sigh in the light. He knew he wouldn't speak of the Dogman, not to anyone, but the knowledge sat heavy in his chest, a reminder that the old stories sometimes had teeth. The Maine woods had always intrigued Arthur Starsky. Thick, shadowed, and teeming with life, they reminded him of the winding back roads of Poughkeepsie, where he grew up. In both places, there was a sense of things lurking just beyond sight, waiting to reveal themselves. Arthur's job as a trucker had given him a certain appreciation for solitude, but it was the thrill of the unknown that had drawn him to the hunting trip this summer. The group, Arthur and 3 friends, had driven deep into the heart of the wilderness. The air smelled of pine and damp moss, and a fresh blanket of snow, unusual for summer, had fallen a few days before, dusting the higher ridges with white. Their camp was simple but sturdy, with a roaring fire at its heart. Arthur sat back in a folding chair, the heat from the flames warming his hands while the others recounted old stories about the forest. He'd heard them all before. Stories about hunters who had disappeared without a trace, strange sounds in the night, even sightings of impossibly large creatures. Arthur had read up on local legends before coming here. Cryptid forums often mentioned Maine as a hotspot for strange occurrences. There were rumors of massive wolves seen stalking the tree line, walking on two legs like men. A werewolf, some said. Others just called it a forest devil. Arthur hadn't believed in any of it, until now. The first night passed uneventfully, with only the usual rustling of animals in the underbrush. On the second day, though, things began to shift. They were tracking a deer in the early afternoon when they heard it, a low, guttural growl that stopped all of them in their tracks. Arthur froze, his shotgun gripped tightly. The sound wasn't like any animal he'd ever heard. Not a bear, not a wolf. It was deep, almost like a growl formed into words, and it came from somewhere just ahead behind the thick veil of snow-dusted pines. "What the hell was that?" one of his friends, Mike, whispered. No one answered. Arthur motioned for silence, his heart pounding as they edged forward. The growl came again, this time to their left. Whatever it was moving. Fast. Arthur caught a glimpse of something dark darting between the trees. It was too large to be a deer, too fast to be a bear, and its shape, it moved upright like a man, but with a loping, predatory gait. A sharp crack echoed through the forest as Mike fired his rifle into the trees. The noise rang out, but there was no sound of a hit. The creature, if it had been there, was gone. By the time they returned to camp, the group was on edge. The snow was falling again, soft but steady, coating the ground and muffling the forest's usual sounds. Arthur built the fire higher, the flickering flames casting long, twisting shadows against the dark. They sat in uneasy silence, listening. The snow made the forest almost unnaturally quiet. Then it came, a howl, distant but unearthly, rising and falling in a way that didn't sound quite animal. The hairs on Arthur's neck stood on end. He thought of his father then, the way he used to sit by the fire with a glass of whiskey, telling Arthur about the things people feared in the wild. "The forest doesn't care about you," his father had said once. "It doesn't play by the rules you think it does." The creature circled their camp for hours, its growls and heavy footsteps coming from different directions as if it were testing their defenses. Once, Arthur thought he saw its eyes, two faintly glowing orbs reflecting the firelight from the edge of the clearing. They didn't sleep that night. Instead, they took turns keeping watch, weapons ready. Arthur thought about his mother, who had always told him to trust his instincts. Those instincts now screamed at him to leave, but there was nowhere to go in the dark. By dawn, the snowfall had eased, but the ground was slippery and uneven. They packed their gear quickly, each man moving with quiet urgency. The plan was to follow the creek downstream, hoping it would lead them back to the road. The forest felt heavier that morning, as if it were holding its breath. The first attack came just as they reached the creek. The creature lunged from the trees, a blur of dark fur and claws. It hit Mike hard, sending him sprawling into the icy water. Arthur raised his shotgun and fired, the blast echoing through the valley. The creature snarled and retreated into the trees, but not before Arthur saw its face, elongated with sharp, yellowed teeth and eyes that burned with an unnatural intelligence. It wasn't just an animal. It was something more. They pulled Mike from the creek, his leg torn and bleeding. He was alive but pale, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We have to keep moving," Arthur said, his voice tight. He took point, his shotgun raised, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The creature followed them, always just out of sight. They could hear it, its heavy steps crunching through the snow, its growls echoing between the trees. It was playing with them, Arthur realized, like a predator toying with its prey. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the group was battered and exhausted. Mike could barely walk, leaning heavily on Arthur for support. The town was just ahead, its rooftops visible through the thinning trees. But the creature made one last charge, bursting from the underbrush with a feral scream. Arthur turned and fired, the blast hitting the creature square in the chest. It stumbled, snarling, before retreating once again into the shadows. This time, it didn't follow. They reached the town just as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds. They didn't call the police. Who would believe them? Instead, they found a doctor for Mike and quietly left town the next day, leaving the forest and its secrets behind. Arthur knew he would never forget those eyes or the sound of the creature's growl. The forest had shown him something that didn't belong in his world, something ancient and untamed. And he knew, deep down, that it was still out there, waiting. The Montana air was crisp as Sylvester Crow pulled into the old gas station. The place looked like it had been patched together with rust and prayer. The single pump wheezed as he filled his tank, and the wind carried a biting chill that hinted at an approaching storm. Sylvester glanced at the mountains in the distance, their jagged peaks cloaked in gathering gray clouds. A storm was definitely brewing, and it would be a cold one. Sylvester wasn't new to unpredictable weather. Back in San Francisco, he'd learned to expect sudden changes. The city was a patchwork of microclimates, 1 minute sunny, the next shrouded in fog. That unpredictability mirrored his life as a police officer, always alert, always on edge. But out here in the vast Montana wilderness, the stakes felt different. The isolation was palpable and it left him uneasy. Inside the gas station, the air smelled of stale coffee and motor oil. The cashier, an older man with a craggy face, barely looked up from his magazine. Sylvester grabbed a candy bar and a bottle of water, exchanging the bare minimum of pleasantries before heading back to his car. He had planned to drive straight through to his destination, but the storm rolled in faster than expected. The wind howled, and rain pelted the windshield, making it nearly impossible to see the road ahead. Sylvester spotted a small pull-off near a cluster of trees and decided to wait it out. He parked, grabbed his jacket, and set up a small fire a few feet into the woods. The flames hissed as raindrops occasionally slipped through the branches above. As he waited, Sylvester's thoughts wandered to his brother, Marcus. Marcus had always been the family storyteller, spinning tales of monsters and legends when they were kids. One story had stuck with Sylvester, a shadowy creature that stalked its victims, toying with them before striking. It was just a game they'd played once, based on a creature from a video game they'd loved. But sitting here in the storm, with the wind carrying eerie whispers through the trees, Sylvester couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The first noise was faint, a branch snapping somewhere in the darkness. Sylvester tensed, his hand instinctively moving to the flashlight on his belt. He shone the beam into the woods, but the light was swallowed by the dense shadows. Another crack, this time closer. He stood, his muscles taut, scanning the tree line. "Hello?" he called, his voice firm but edged with unease. Silence. Then, from the corner of his eye, he caught movement, a flash of something pale slipping behind a tree. He swung the flashlight, but there was nothing there. His mind raced. A deer? A coyote? But the shape hadn't moved like an animal. It had been upright. The firelight flickered, and the rain picked up, making it harder to hear. Sylvester crouched, feeding the fire more wood to keep it alive. That's when he heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but distorted, as if it came from a broken throat. It sent a chill racing down his spine. He stood, drawing the hunting knife he kept in his bag. The sound came again, closer this time, and he realized with growing dread that whatever was out there wasn't afraid of him. He thought about the stories Marcus used to tell, and for the first time, he wished his brother was here to laugh it off and tell him he was overthinking. The thing in the woods circled him for what felt like hours. He'd catch glimpses of it. A pale figure, lanky and impossibly tall, darting between the trees. The growls turned into a mocking, guttural laughter like it was enjoying his fear. Sylvester's heart hammered as he backed toward his car, never taking his eyes off the tree line. Suddenly it emerged, just far enough for him to see its outline. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Sylvester's grip on his knife tightened. The creature didn't charge. It just stood there, swaying slightly, its hollow eyes fixed on him. Then it moved. Fast. Fast. Too fast. Sylvester stumbled backward, tripping over a root as the creature darted past him, close enough that he could feel the rush of air. It didn't attack. Instead, it disappeared into the woods again, leaving him panting and disoriented. It was playing with him, just like the stories. He scrambled to his feet, abandoning the fire and bolting for the car. The rain was a torrent now, and the wind howled like a living thing. He fumbled with his keys, his wet hands slipping, before finally getting the door open. He climbed in, locking the doors and starting the engine. The headlights illuminated the woods, and for a brief second, he saw it. Standing in the middle of the road, its head cocked, watching him. Its pale skin glistened in the rain, and its mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. Sylvester floored the gas pedal, the car skidding as it tore away from the pull-off. He drove for miles, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. His phone had no signal, and the storm made it impossible to call for help even if he wanted to. Finally, he reached a small diner on the outskirts of a town. He parked and sat there, shaking, before finally stepping inside. The waitress gave him a curious look as he ordered coffee, his clothes still soaked. He didn't tell her what he'd seen. Who would believe him? Instead, he stared out the window, watching the storm rage on, and wondered if the creature was still out there, stalking someone else in the darkness. He'd always thought Marcus's stories were just that, stories. But now, Sylvester wasn't so sure. Whatever was out there in the Montana woods wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it was hunting. The rain had started as a drizzle, but quickly turned into a steady downpour, drenching the thick pine forest surrounding the isolated cabin. Damien Cavell pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders as he stepped onto the cabin's small porch, staring out into the gray blur of the Wyoming wilderness. The cabin wasn't much, just a small structure with a single room, a fireplace, and a bed pushed against the far wall. It had been meant as a short reprieve, a quiet getaway from the chaos of his work back in San Francisco. Damien had spent years as a police officer there, navigating a world of unpredictability, but this solitude felt strange, almost unsettling. He had chosen Wyoming because it was vast and empty, a place where the world seemed to stretch endlessly. The forests here had a wildness to them, their towering trees and dense underbrush unbroken for miles. Back in the city, Damien had grown used to the constant hum of life. Cars, voices, the distant wail of sirens. Here, the silence was deep, broken only by the patter of rain and the occasional rustle of wind. Inside, the fire crackled softly, casting flickering light across the cabin walls. Damien had always been practical, but something about the storm outside had stirred old, buried fears. He chuckled to himself as he fed another log into the fire, remembering a game he used to play with his younger brother, Jacob, years ago. It was an old horror game about creatures in the woods, monsters that stalked the night, their howls echoing through the trees. Jacob had always been terrified, jumping at every shadow, but Damien had enjoyed the thrill of it, laughing at his brother's expense. Now, in this remote cabin with the storm raging outside, the memory didn't feel quite as funny. It was as he turned back to the window that he heard it, a low, guttural sound that froze him in place. It wasn't the wind nor the rain. This was something else, something alive. Damien moved slowly to the window, peering out into the forest. The rain blurred his vision, but he caught a flicker of movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. He pressed his hand against the cool glass, straining to see. For a moment, the rain seemed to lessen, and he spotted it. A shape, large and hulking, moving unnaturally fast through the undergrowth. It stopped suddenly, standing upright, and Damien's breath caught. It was too far to make out details, but the outline was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, long limbs, and a head that seemed too large, with pointed ears silhouetted against the gray sky. The figure tilted its head slightly as though it were listening. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the trees. Damien backed away from the window, his heart pounding. His training as a police officer kicked in, and he mentally cataloged his options. He had brought a knife, a flashlight, and a flare gun with him, along with the axe by the woodpile outside. None of it felt like enough. He paced the small room, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. A bear? No. Bears didn't move like that, and they didn't stand like that. The sound came again, closer this time, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through his chest. Damien grabbed the knife and the flashlight, his grip tight. He moved to the door, opening it just a crack. The rain had picked up again, falling in heavy sheets, but he could hear movement now, the crunch of wet leaves and snapping branches. Whatever it was circling the cabin. Then came the slam. Something heavy struck the side of the cabin, hard enough to make the walls shudder. Damien stumbled back, his flashlight beam shaking as he pointed it toward the noise. Another slam, this time at the back of the cabin. It was testing the structure, feeling for weaknesses. The fire sputtered as a gust of wind blew through the open door, and Damien quickly shut it, locking it tight. The creature continued its assault, moving around the cabin, hitting the walls with enough force to send dust falling from the rafters. Damien knew he couldn't stay. If it decided to break through, he wouldn't stand a chance. He grabbed his pack, slipping the knife into a sheath on his belt and tucking the flare gun into his jacket pocket. He couldn't call for help. There was no cell service this far out. His only option was to make a run for the village he'd passed on his way in, several miles downhill through the forest. He waited for a moment of silence, then threw open the door and bolted into the rain. The forest was a maze of shadows and slick ground. But he ran, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Behind him, he heard the creature give chase, its heavy footsteps splashing through the mud. Damien didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The growls grew louder, closer, and he realized with a sinking feeling that it was toying with him. It could have caught him by now if it wanted to. Instead, it darted through the trees, staying just out of sight, letting him know it was there. He tripped on a root, going down hard, the mud soaking through his clothes. Scrambling to his feet, he fired the flare gun into the air, the bright red light illuminating the forest for a brief moment. That's when he saw it. The creature was massive, its fur matted and black, its eyes reflecting the flare's glow. Its mouth curled into a snarl, revealing sharp, glistening teeth. It was standing just a few yards away, watching him. Damien didn't wait. He ran, his lungs burning, his legs screaming with effort. The village lights appeared like a beacon through the trees, and Damien pushed himself harder. The creature let out a howl, the sound chilling and primal, but it didn't follow him any farther. He stumbled into the edge of the village, collapsing onto the dirt road. A few startled locals came out, their faces a mix of concern and confusion, but Damien couldn't bring himself to explain. What could he say? That a werewolf had stalked him through the woods? The storm raged on as he sat there, catching his breath. The creature was still out there, he knew. Watching. Waiting. And Damien knew he'd never look at the wilderness the same way again. The Wisconsin wilderness lay frozen under a thick blanket of snow, the forest silent, except for the occasional whisper of wind rustling through the skeletal branches of trees. Nick Rambo adjusted the strap of his pack, his boots crunching against the icy trail as he led the group deeper into the woods. He'd always loved winter hikes, but something about this day felt off. The air was too still, the forest too quiet. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were being watched. Nick had grown up in the Midwest, where winters could be brutal and beautiful in equal measure. As a park ranger, he'd spent years navigating rugged trails and teaching others how to respect and survive the wild. Today's hike was supposed to be straightforward, a few hours exploring the forest with a couple of friends from out of town. The group had started the day excited, laughing as their breath formed clouds in the crisp, cold air. Now the laughter had faded, replaced by an uneasy tension. "Hey, Nick," one of his friends, Jared, called from the back of the line. "How much farther until we hit the clearing?" "Not long," Nick replied, glancing over his shoulder. It's just past that ridge up ahead. The ridge loomed dark against the pale sky, its jagged line cutting through the forest. Nick felt a flicker of doubt as they approached it. He'd been here dozens of times before, but today the trail seemed unfamiliar, as though the landscape had shifted in subtle, disorienting ways. As they crested the ridge, they paused to catch their breath. The clearing lay below, its expanse of snow broken only by the gnarled trunks of scattered trees. Nick scanned the area, his ranger instincts kicking in. Something about the scene made his skin crawl. The snow wasn't untouched. It was disturbed, crisscrossed with tracks too large to belong to any deer or coyote. The prints were spaced too far apart, as though whatever had made them had a massive stride. "What do you think did that?" asked Kara, another member of the group. Her voice was hushed, her breath visible in the frigid air. Nick hesitated. "Could be a bear," he said, though he didn't believe it. Bears were rare this time of year, and their tracks didn't look like this, long, clawed impressions that dug deep into the snow. They descended into the clearing cautiously, their boots slipping on patches of ice hidden beneath the snow. Nick's hand drifted to the hunting knife on his belt, a reflex more than anything. He told himself there was no real danger, but the unease in his chest refused to go away. As they reached the center of the clearing, he turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest's edge. And then he saw it. It was just a shape at first, and a shadow against the trees. It stood motionless, half hidden by the thick trunks. But even at a distance, Nick could tell it wasn't human. It was too tall, too gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long. Its head was misshapen, with pointed ears that jutted upward. For a moment, Nick thought his mind was playing tricks on him. Then it moved, stepping out of the shadows with a slow, deliberate grace. The creature's face was a nightmare, a grotesque mix of human and animal features, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Nick's breath caught in his throat as it tilted its head, as though studying them. And then it let out a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the clearing. "Run," Nick said, his voice barely above a whisper. The group hesitated, frozen in fear. The creature took a step forward, its claws glinting in the weak sunlight. That was enough to break the spell. They turned and bolted, slipping and stumbling as they raced back up the ridge. Nick stayed at the back, his heart pounding as he glanced over his shoulder. The creature didn't follow immediately. Instead, it prowled at the edge of the clearing, watching them go. They reached the ridge and scrambled down the other side, the snow making their descent treacherous. Nick could hear Kara sobbing, her breaths ragged. Jared swore under his breath, his words muffled by the scarf wrapped around his face. They didn't stop until they reached a cluster of trees that provided a momentary refuge. Nick motioned for them to stay quiet, his hand on his knife. The forest was still again, but it didn't feel like safety. It felt like the calm before a storm. "What was that thing?" Jared hissed, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Nick admitted. He didn't want to say what he was thinking, that it reminded him of a creature he'd seen in a video game years ago. A rugaru, the game had called it. He'd laughed it off then, dismissing it as folklore. Now, he wasn't so sure. A loud crack echoed through the trees, followed by a heavy thud. The creature was close, its movements heavy and deliberate. Nick lit a small fire, hoping the light and smoke would keep it at bay. They huddled around it, their faces pale and drawn in the flickering glow. Nick thought of his sister, back home in Ohio, and the way she used to tease him for being too serious. He wondered if he'd ever get the chance to tell her she was right. The fire didn't keep the creature away for long. It slammed against a tree just beyond the light, the impact sending a shower of snow cascading down. Nick knew they couldn't stay here. "We need to move," he said. "Stick together and stay quiet." They extinguished the fire and crept through the forest, the creature's growls following them. It was toying with them, while staying just out of sight but close enough to remind them it was there. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in around them. Finally, after what felt like hours, they broke through the tree line and onto the main road. The sound of an approaching car was the sweetest thing Nick had ever heard. He waved his arms frantically, and the vehicle, A beat-up pickup truck skidded to a stop. The driver, an older man with a weathered face, stared at them in confusion as they piled into the back. "Drive," Nick said. "Just drive." The truck sped away, the creature's silhouette vanishing into the distance. Nick slumped against the side of the truck bed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They were safe, for now. As the truck rumbled toward civilization, Nick stared out at the dark forest, his mind racing. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't supposed to exist, but it did. And he knew he'd never forget the way it had looked at them, its glowing eyes full of something far worse than hunger. The wind cut through the dense woods like a blade, carrying with it the biting cold of a New York winter. George Evans adjusted his scarf, exhaling a plume of mist into the icy air. His boots crunched in the snow as he made his way back toward the campsite. He carried an armful of firewood, the branches stiff and brittle in the freezing temperatures. His friends had stayed behind to set up camp near a frozen creek deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. The Adirondacks were a world away from Seattle, where George had spent most of his life, surrounded by the damp chill of coastal rain and bustling city streets. Here, the trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow, and the world felt impossibly vast and empty. It was beautiful, but in an eerie, unsettling way. As he approached the camp, the orange glow of the fire came into view, flickering against the snowy backdrop. The rest of the group, David, Sarah, and Mike, were huddled around it, their faces illuminated in the light. A pot of stew simmered on the flames, its aroma wafting through the cold air. "About time, George," David called out, his breath visible in the chill. "We thought you got lost out there." "Almost," George replied, dropping the wood near the fire. "But I couldn't resist a few extra sticks. You don't want the fire dying on a night like this." Sarah rolled her eyes, but there was warmth in her smile. Spoken like a true cook, always thinking about fuel for the fire. The group laughed, their voices briefly cutting through the stillness of the forest. They'd been friends for years, bonded over shared college memories and late-night adventures. This camping trip was a reunion of sorts, a chance to escape the grind of their lives and reconnect. But as George looked out at the dark forest, he couldn't shake a growing unease. There was something oppressive about the silence, like the woods were holding their breath. He'd seen an old TV show years ago that talked about strange creatures in the Adirondacks, things that defied explanation, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. He'd laughed it off at the time, but now the memory gnawed at the back of his mind. "Earth to George," Mike said, snapping his fingers. "You okay?" "Yeah," George replied, shaking his head. "Just tired. Let's eat." They passed the evening trading stories and jokes, the fire crackling steadily as snowflakes began to drift lazily from the sky. George found himself relaxing, the warmth of the fire and the camaraderie of his friends pushing the unease aside. But then, somewhere in the distance, a noise cut through the calm, a deep, guttural growl that sent a shiver down George's spine. The group fell silent, their laughter dying instantly. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Probably just an animal," David said, though he didn't sound convinced. George stood, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The sound had been too close, and it didn't match anything he'd ever heard before. It wasn't a bear or a coyote, it was something else. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of branches snapping. Whatever it was moving closer. "Get the knives," George said, his voice low and steady. Mike grabbed a hunting knife from his pack, while David picked up a hatchet. Sarah clutched a heavy flashlight, her hands trembling. George felt his pulse quicken as he stared into the woods, the firelight casting long shadows that seemed to dance and twist. Then it appeared. The creature moved with an unnatural fluidity, its form obscured by the darkness. It was tall, its limbs too long, its body shifting and almost translucent. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers smoldering in the gloom. George felt a wave of primal fear wash over him as it stepped closer, its movements deliberate, predatory. "Run," George whispered, his voice shaking. They didn't need to be told twice. The group bolted, leaving the fire and their gear behind. The creature let out a deafening screech, the sound echoing through the trees as it gave chase. The snow made running difficult, their boots slipping and sinking with every step. George stayed at the back, his heart pounding as he kept an eye on the creature. It was fast, too fast, its form darting between the trees within human speed. "Head for the car," George shouted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The car was parked over a mile away, near the edge of the forest. It felt impossibly far, the trees closing in around them as the creature's screeches grew louder. They reached a small clearing and paused to catch their breath. The creature was still behind them, its glowing eyes visible through the trees. George picked up a fallen branch, lighting it with a match from his pocket. He waved the makeshift torch, hoping to buy them some time. "Go!" he yelled, and the others took off again. The creature lunged, its claws raking through the air just inches from George's back. He swung the torch wildly, the flames casting wild shadows. It hesitated, snarling, and George used the moment to sprint after his friends. By the time they reached the car, they were half frozen and barely able to breathe. Mike fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the doors. They piled in, slamming the doors shut just as the creature emerged from the trees. "Drive!" Sarah screamed. The car roared to life, the tires skidding on the icy ground as they sped away. George watched through the rearview mirror as the creature faded into the distance, its glowing eyes the last thing to disappear. They didn't stop until they reached the nearest town, their faces pale and drawn. George called his sister once they were safe, his voice shaking as he told her they were okay. He didn't mention the creature. He wasn't sure she'd believe him. As he sat in the motel that night, staring out at the snow-covered streets, George couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't supposed to exist. But it did. And he knew he'd never forget the sound of its growl, or the way it had moved through the trees like a nightmare come to life. The air in the Michigan wilderness was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. Nick Reeves adjusted the straps on his pack, squinting against the fading sunlight filtering through the dense canopy of trees. He and his friends, Mark, Jenna, and Lisa, had been hiking for hours, the narrow trail winding deeper into the forest. The plan had seemed simple enough. Spend 3 days exploring the Manistee National Forest, camping under the stars and catching up on life. For Nick, the change of pace was welcome. Miami felt a world away now, its humid, crowded streets replaced by sprawling green and crisp air. Growing up in a family where every moment was scheduled, Nick had always gravitated toward the outdoors as his escape. Being a police officer meant he rarely got time to breathe these days. This trip, spearheaded by Jenna, was meant to remind them all of simpler times. They reached a small clearing just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the woods in a blue-gray light. Snow began to drift lazily from the sky, a strange and unseasonal occurrence in the middle of summer. Nick thought of the stories he'd heard from old-timers during his academy days, campfire tales about the skinwalker, a creature said to haunt the remote corners of America. He'd dismissed it then, the way anyone rational would. But standing here, in the eerie quiet, he felt a twinge of unease. "Here should work for tonight," Jenna said, dropping her pack and shaking the stiffness from her legs. "Mark, can you start the fire? Nick, you've got the tent." As they worked, Nick found his thoughts wandering to his father, a retired Navy man with an eye for discipline and a knack for making everything into a lesson. "Preparation is survival," his father used to say. Nick could almost hear him now, urging him to double-check the ropes or scan the perimeter. By the time the fire was roaring and the tents were up, the snow had thickened, blanketing the ground in a thin layer of white. They sat around the flames, passing a flask of whiskey and laughing at old stories. Lisa was mid-tale about a disastrous first date when the sound came. A branch snapped, sharp and deliberate, somewhere beyond the edge of the firelight. They all froze, the laughter dying instantly. "What was that?" Mark asked, his voice low. Nick stood, his hand instinctively moving to the knife strapped to his belt. His training told him it was probably an animal, deer maybe, or a curious raccoon. But deep down, something about the sound didn't feel right. "Stay here," he said, his voice steady. "I'll check it out." "No way," Jenna whispered. "We're not splitting up." Nick hesitated but nodded, motioning for everyone to stay close to the fire. He scanned the darkness, his flashlight cutting through the trees in jerky, hesitant sweeps. The silence was oppressive now, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire behind them. Then they saw it. A figure stood between the trees, its outline barely discernible in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs elongated and wrong. Its face, or what should have been its face, was obscured, but Nick felt its gaze, sharp and predatory, like knives pressed to his skin. "Is that a person?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Nick said. His throat was dry, his instincts screaming at him to run. But before he could say anything else, the figure moved. It lunged forward, covering the distance between them in seconds. Nick shouted, drawing his knife and pushing the others back toward the fire. The creature stopped just outside the circle of light, snarling, a low, guttural sound that sent chills racing down Nick's spine. "Stay by the fire," he barked, waving the blade in front of him. Firelight flickered off the creature's shifting form, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it circled them. "Nick, what do we do?" Jenna asked, her voice cracking. "We keep it back." His mind raced, recalling every tactic he'd learned for fending off an attacker. But this wasn't human. The stories he'd dismissed came flooding back. Accounts of creatures that mimicked voices, lured people into the woods, and vanished without a trace. The creature lunged again, its claws swiping dangerously close to Nick's face. He slashed at it, the blade connecting with something solid. The creature howled, a sound that reverberated through the forest, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it circled faster, testing their defenses. "We can't stay here," Nick said, his voice grim. "We need to move." "But it's watching us," Lisa cried. "We'll use the snow to cover our tracks. Stick together, move quietly." Gathering their packs, they doused the fire, plunging the clearing into near total darkness. The creature snarled from somewhere close, its glowing eyes visible in the distance. Nick led the way, his heart pounding as they crept through the forest. Every step felt like an eternity, the snow muffling their movements but also slowing them down. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The creature's presence was a constant shadow, its snarls and growls never far behind. At one point, they hid beneath a fallen tree, holding their breaths as it prowled just feet away. Nick gripped his knife so tightly his hand ached, ready to strike if it came too close. They finally reached a shallow ravine, the trees thinning as the terrain sloped downward. The faint glow of dawn was visible on the horizon, a welcome sign after the suffocating night. But the creature wasn't done. It charged again, its form blurred and shifting in the dim light. Nick turned, planting his feet as he held the knife out. "Go! I'll hold it off!" he shouted. "No!" Jenna grabbed his arm, pulling him with her as the others scrambled down the ravine. The creature screeched, its claws raking the air just inches from Nick's back. They ran until their lungs burned, the cold air searing their throats. When they finally broke through the tree line and saw the faint outline of a road in the distance, relief flooded Nick's chest. A passing truck slowed as they stumbled onto the asphalt, the driver's eyes wide with alarm as he took in their disheveled, pale faces. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked. "Just," Nick said, climbing into the cab. "Get us out of here." The truck roared to life, carrying them away from the forest and whatever nightmare lurked within it. As they sped down the road, Nick looked back one last time. The creature stood at the edge of the woods, its glowing eyes watching them disappear. Nick didn't say a word. There was no explanation that would make sense. But deep down, he knew the stories were true. And he knew he'd never return to those woods again. The Arizona desert had an eerie beauty to it, especially in autumn. The sparse canopy of junipers and pinon pines swayed against the gusty winds that had picked up that evening, scattering golden leaves across the forest floor. Sean Winchester adjusted his hood, the wind biting at his face as he stood beside the crackling campfire. The flames whipped unpredictably, almost as if the elements themselves were conspiring to extinguish their fragile light. Sean had never been one for camping trips. Growing up in Los Angeles, surrounded by the constant hum of traffic and the glow of city lights, he was more accustomed to bustling sidewalks than isolated trails. But this trip was a promise, a pact between old friends who hadn't seen each other in years. Alex, a tech junkie who never left home without at least 2 portable chargers, had spearheaded the idea. Mia, the self-proclaimed adventurer, had chosen the remote site, tucked away near the Mogollon Rim. And Mark, ever the skeptic, had come along for the ride, but spent most of the time rolling his eyes at Mia's enthusiasm. Sean poked at the fire absently, his thoughts wandering. He hadn't admitted it to anyone, but he wasn't entirely comfortable being far from civilization. His older brother used to tease him about his urban sensibilities, calling him the least outdoorsy Winchester alive. Sean smirked at the memory, though the pang of loss that followed was hard to ignore. His brother had been gone for years, but little moments like this, a fire under the stars, brought the memories rushing back. Mia's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Mark groaned. "Come on, Mia. You've been on about this werewolf country nonsense since we got here. Just admit it. You watched too many horror movies growing up." "It's not nonsense," she shot back, leaning forward. The firelight cast flickering shadows across her face, making her look momentarily otherworldly. "This area is famous for weird sightings. Skinwalkers, werewolves, chupacabra, you name it. You never know what's out there." Alex chuckled nervously. "Well, whatever's out there can keep to itself. I don't plan on meeting anything tonight." Sean stayed quiet, his eyes scanning the darkened tree line beyond the fire. The wind was louder now, whistling through the branches. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a shape shifting in the shadows. But when he blinked, it was gone. "It's probably coyotes," he said, more to reassure himself than anyone else. "They're common out here." Mia opened her mouth to retort, but stopped abruptly, her gaze fixed on something behind Sean. He turned slowly, his stomach nodding as he followed her line of sight. At first, he didn't see anything. Then, just beyond the flicker of firelight, he saw it. A figure sat behind a tree, its form partially obscured by the trunk. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. It crouched unnaturally still, its limbs bent at odd angles. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight like a predator's. "Is that a person?" Alex whispered, his voice trembling. "No," Mia said, her tone flat and cold. Sean's heart hammered in his chest as he tried to process what he was seeing. It wasn't human, that much was clear. Its face was stretched and gaunt, its eyes too large for its skull. The longer he looked, the more wrong it seemed, as though it was wearing the skin of something it didn't quite fit into. The creature didn't move. It just stared, its gaze unblinking and fixed on their group. "Okay," Mark said, his voice shaking. "Time to go." Sean stood, slowly, every muscle in his body tensed. "We don't run," he said quietly. "We back away. Get to the car." The others nodded, their fear palpable. They moved as a group, inching away from the fire and toward the trail they'd come in on. Sean kept his eyes on the creature, half expecting it to lunge at any moment. But it didn't. It remained behind the tree, its eyes tracking their every step. The wind howled as they reached the edge of the campsite. Sean turned to lead the way when he heard it, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to shake the ground beneath them. He glanced back just in time to see the creature stand. It was massive, towering over the tree it had crouched behind, its limbs impossibly long and sinewy. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it let out a sound that was somewhere between a roar and a scream. "Run!" Sean shouted. They broke into a sprint, the wind tearing at their clothes as they raced through the forest. Branches clawed at their faces, and the uneven ground threatened to trip them at every step. Sean's mind raced, adrenaline drowning out everything but the primal instinct to survive. Behind them, the creature gave chase. Its footsteps were thunderous, crashing through the underbrush with terrifying speed. Sean risked a glance back and saw it closing the distance, its glowing eyes locked on him. Alex stumbled and went down hard. Sean skidded to a stop, turning back to help him. "Get up!" he yelled, hauling Alex to his feet. The creature was nearly upon them, its claws slicing through the air where Alex had been moments before. They ran until the trees began to thin, the faint outline of their car visible in the distance. Sean could feel the creature's presence right behind him, its breath hot on his neck. He fumbled for the keys as they reached the car, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped them. "Get in!" he shouted, shoving Alex into the back seat. Mia and Mark scrambled in after him, and Sean slammed the driver's door just as the creature reached them. It slammed into the side of the car, rocking it violently. Sean started the engine, his heart in his throat. The headlights illuminated the creature for the first time in full detail. Its fur was matted and dark, its eyes wild with fury. It roared, slamming its fists against the hood as Sean threw the car into gear and floored it. They sped down the dirt road, the creature chasing them for several agonizing moments before it finally disappeared into the shadows. The car was silent, except for their ragged breathing, each of them too shaken to speak. Sean didn't stop driving until they were miles away, the safety of a well-lit gas station finally in sight. They piled out of the car, collapsing onto the pavement in relief. "What the hell was that?" Alex finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sean didn't answer. He didn't have one. All he knew was that he'd never forget those glowing eyes or the way they'd stared right through him. The wind howled through the dense forest, carrying flurries of snow that stung Gary Johnson's face as he stoked the campfire. Winter in Maine was unforgiving, but Gary wasn't the type to shy away from the cold. A contractor from Boulder, Colorado, he was used to working through bitter winds and icy mornings. Still, this was different. The Maine woods had a weight to them, an oppressive quiet beneath the storm that gnawed at the nerves. Gary and his friends, Eric, the group's optimist, Lisa, whose sarcasm was matched only by her tenacity, and Danny, the cautious one, had decided on this trip months ago. Eric had pitched it as a way to unplug, reconnect with nature, and maybe do a little ice fishing. But now, sitting in the eerie glow of the fire as the storm intensified, Gary wondered if they'd bitten off more than they could chew. The cabin they'd rented was a mile down a winding path from the main road, nestled in a secluded stretch of forest. It was picturesque in the way only snow-blanketed landscapes could be, but something about the isolation felt wrong. Gary had read about these woods before, not in guidebooks or travel blogs, but in the sensationalist tabloids that lined gas station checkout counters. Stories of strange sightings, unexplained disappearances, and whispered legends of skinwalkers, shape-shifting entities that could mimic human voices and appearances. He'd dismissed it as nonsense at the time. Now, he wasn't so sure. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Lisa asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was casual, but her eyes flicked toward the shadows beyond the firelight. "Don't start," Danny muttered, poking at the snow with a stick. "It's just the wind. Always sounds like something out here." "It's not just the wind," Lisa said, her tone sharpening. "I'm serious. Look." She pointed toward the tree line, and the others followed her gaze. Gary squinted, his breath fogging in the icy air. For a moment he saw nothing but swaying branches and the faint glimmer of snow. Then a flicker of movement, subtle, almost imperceptible. Something was there. Something that shouldn't be. "Probably a deer," Eric said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Deer don't stand still like that," Lisa replied. Gary stood, his boots crunching in the snow. He grabbed a flashlight from his bag and shone it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating branches weighed down with snow. But there was nothing there. Whatever it was had vanished. "Let's just stay close to the fire," Gary said, his voice calm despite the unease twisting in his gut. "Storm's picking up. We'll head back to the cabin soon." The group huddled closer, the fire crackling as the wind roared around them. Gary couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. He thought of his family back in Boulder, his mom's easy laugh, his dad's gruff but steady advice. They were practical people, not prone to superstition, but his grandmother had always believed in the old stories. Gary remembered her warning him as a child. "The woods have eyes, Gary, and they don't always blink kindly." The sound of a snapping branch yanked him from his thoughts. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the source. It came again, closer this time, a deliberate, heavy crunch of snow underfoot. "Gary," Lisa whispered, gripping his arm. Then came the voice, soft, distant, but unmistakable. "Help me." It was Eric's voice, calling from the darkness, but Eric was sitting right beside them. "Help me," the voice called again, closer now. Eric's face went pale. "What the? That's me." Gary's blood ran cold. He'd heard stories of skinwalkers mimicking human voices, luring people into the woods, but hearing it was something else entirely. "Get to the cabin," he said, his voice firm. "Now." They didn't argue. Gathering their things, they moved quickly but carefully, their flashlight beams bouncing through the dark. The path to the cabin felt longer than before, the snow deeper, the trees pressing in around them. Gary kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see something emerging from the shadows. When they reached the cabin, Gary locked the door behind them and shoved a heavy chair against it for good measure. Lisa lit an oil lamp, its warm glow filling the room as they all caught their breath. "What the hell was that?" Danny asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Gary admitted, "but it's not over." Before anyone could respond, a loud thud rattled the cabin. Then another. Something was slamming against the walls, circling the structure, testing its defenses. The sound of nails or claws scraping against the wood set their teeth on edge. "Stay away from the windows," Gary warned. He grabbed a hunting knife from his bag, the blade gleaming in the lamplight. The creature wasn't giving up. The slamming grew more aggressive, the walls trembling with each impact. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was almost worse. Gary strained to hear over the howling wind. For a moment, he thought it might be gone. Then he heard the faintest sound, footsteps on the roof. It was above them. The group huddled in the center of the room, their breaths shallow, their eyes darting to the ceiling. The creature moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring their fear. Then it happened. The trapdoor to the attic burst open, and a long, emaciated hand reached down. Lisa screamed as Gary lunged, Taft slashing at the limb with his knife. The creature let out a guttural scream, retreating into the shadows. "Run!" Gary shouted, throwing the door open. They bolted into the storm. The wind whipping around them as they fled down the path. The creature gave chase, its inhuman cries echoing through the forest. Gary didn't look back. He could hear it gaining on them, the heavy thud of its footsteps pounding through the snow. Ahead, the faint glow of headlights appeared, someone driving down the main road. Desperation fueled their legs as they pushed toward the light, the creature's snarls growing louder. They burst onto the road just as the car approached. The driver slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. Gary waved frantically, and the group piled into the vehicle, breathless and terrified. "What the hell happened to you?" the driver asked, but Gary couldn't answer. He stared out the window, watching the tree line as they sped away. He thought he saw those glowing eyes one last time, watching them disappear into the night. The rain began as a misting over the winding roads of the Ozark Mountains, dampening the excitement Chuck Norris and his friends felt just hours earlier. The air carried the sharp scent of wet earth and the faint hum of cicadas. The song muffled cicadas, their song. Chuck, an ambulance driver from Miami, had suggested the road trip as a way to escape the sweltering heat of Florida's summer. The Ozarks, with their dense forests and winding rivers, seemed like the perfect getaway. Chuck had driven most of the way, his hands steady on the wheel. He was used to long hours on the road, navigating tight city streets and unpredictable traffic. But the Ozarks were different, a maze of curving roads and towering trees that loomed like silent sentinels. He thought about Miami's beaches, the rush of surf and the gleam of neon lights. Here, the world felt older, untamed. The group, Chuck, his childhood friend Josh, Josh's girlfriend Taylor, and Chuck's younger sister, Beth, pulled over at a clearing by a small stream. Rain pattered on the canopy of leaves overhead, creating a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic. "Let's set up here," Taylor suggested, brushing her auburn hair out of her face. "It's pretty, and we could use a break." Chuck nodded, pulling the car off the narrow road. They unloaded a small stove and some camping chairs, setting up under a tarp they stretched between two trees. The stream bubbled nearby, its sound mingling with the rain. As they sat around the fire they'd managed to coax to life, Chuck felt a pang of nostalgia. He thought of their dad, who'd always insisted on family camping trips. Dad had a knack for finding the perfect spots that felt just a little magical. Chuck could almost hear his father's gravelly voice, teasing him for forgetting the matches again. The rain grew heavier as the afternoon stretched on. They told stories to pass the time, laughing over exaggerated memories from their youth. It wasn't until Beth fell quiet staring into the woods that Chuck noticed something felt off. "What is it?" he asked her. "I thought I saw something," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the rain. Josh scoffed. "Probably a deer." "No," Beth said firmly. "It wasn't a deer. I don't know. It just felt wrong." Chuck followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing. The trees swayed in the breeze, their trunks slick with rain. Nothing seemed out of place, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "Maybe we should pack up and head to town," he suggested. Before anyone could respond, a faint rustling came from the tree line. The sound was subtle, almost blending with the rain, but unmistakable. "Hello?" Taylor called, her voice trembling. There was no answer, but the rustling grew louder, closer. A shadow moved between the trees, too large for a deer, too silent for a human. Chuck's chest tightened. He'd read about this sort of thing before, in a magazine he'd picked up during a slow shift at the station. The article had been about skinwalkers, creatures from Navajo legends said to mimic humans and animals. He'd brushed it off as superstition then, but now... "Stay together," he ordered, his voice firm. The shadows circled the clearing, just beyond the firelight. Every so often, Chuck caught a glimpse, a flash of pale, elongated limbs, a face that seemed almost human but horribly wrong. The rain poured harder, turning the ground to mud. The fire sputtered, struggling to stay lit. Suddenly, a low, guttural sound echoed through the trees. "We're not staying here," Chuck said, grabbing his flashlight. They moved quickly, packing what they could carry. The creature didn't follow immediately, but Chuck could feel its presence by lurking just beyond their sight. They headed back toward the road, the mud sucking at their boots. The rain masked their footsteps, but it also made it harder to hear if the creature was following. "Did you see its eyes?" Beth whispered. Chuck nodded grimly. "Don't look back, just keep moving." The creature began toying with them, breaking branches in the distance, mimicking their voices in chillingly perfect tones. "Chuck," it called in Beth's voice. "Over here." Beth clung to him, her nails digging into his arm. "Don't stop," Chuck said. The road was still a mile away. They moved in silence, their breath fogging in the cool air. Suddenly, the creature let out an ear-piercing screech, and Chuck knew it was no longer content to stalk. "Run," he yelled. They sprinted through the woods, branches clawing at their clothes. The creature's footsteps thundered behind them, impossibly fast. Chuck could hear Beth sobbing, Taylor cursing, Josh yelling for them to keep going. The road came into view, a ribbon of asphalt gleaming in the rain. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, and Chuck waved frantically. The car skidded to a stop, the driver a middle-aged man with a bewildered expression, opening his door. "What's going on?" he asked. "No time," Chuck gasped. "Get us out of here." The group piled into the car, slamming the doors shut. As they sped away, Chuck glanced out the back window. The creature stood at the edge of the road, its pale form illuminated by the taillights. Its face was twisted into a mockery of a smile, and its eyes glowed with a malevolent light. They didn't stop until they reached the safety of a nearby town. Chuck didn't sleep that night, his mind replaying the events over and over. He knew they'd escaped, but the creature's image lingered in his thoughts, a reminder that some legends were more than just stories. The rain was unrelenting, pouring down on the Appalachian foothills like a warning. George Starsky adjusted his hood, glancing through the windshield as the wipers struggled to keep up. He was used to the sun-drenched streets of Los Angeles, where he worked long shifts under fluorescent lights and spent his weekends basking in California's endless summer. The Appalachians, though, were a whole other world, a tangle of mist-shrouded trees and winding roads that seemed to lead nowhere. "We could have just gone to Vegas," muttered Mike, George's friend from high school. He was sprawled in the passenger seat, scrolling aimlessly on his phone. "Where's the adventure in that?" George shot back. From the back seat, Julia chimed in. "Besides, this is way better than losing all our money on slot machines. Fresh air, beautiful scenery, ghost stories." "Bigfoot stories," corrected Dave, leaning forward between the seats. "This area is famous for sightings." George chuckled, though his grip on the steering wheel tightened. Growing up, his uncle had told him wild tales about creatures in the woods, stories meant to keep kids from wandering too far. He never believed them, but something about the Appalachians felt different. The group had decided to camp for the night after a long day of hiking. They found a clearing near a ridge with a decent view of the valley below. The rain hadn't let up, so they set up camp under the trees, using tarps to keep dry. The fire crackled weakly, struggling against the dampness. As the evening wore on, the group gathered around the fire, swapping stories and laughing over old memories. George found himself thinking about his mom and dad, about weekends spent tinkering with cars in their driveway. His dad had been a man of few words, but he'd always had a knack for fixing things, for finding solutions. George figured that's where he got it from, the drive to keep going no matter what. It wasn't until the fire burned low that Julia froze, her gaze fixed on the shadows beyond the trees. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The laughter died instantly. George strained his ears, but all he could hear was the rain tapping on the tarp and the distant howl of the wind. "What was it?" Dave asked. I don't know. It sounded like breathing." Mike scoffed. "Probably just an animal, a deer or something." But George couldn't shake the unease that crept over him. He grabbed a flashlight and swept the beam across the trees. The forest seemed impossibly dense, the light swallowed up by the darkness. "Let's not freak ourselves out," he said, trying to sound confident. The group settled back down, but the mood was tense. George kept catching Julia glancing over her shoulder, her hand gripping the hilt of a utility knife. An hour later, as the fire flickered weakly, a low, guttural noise broke the quiet. It wasn't a growl exactly, more like a deep, rumbling exhale coming from just beyond the firelight. George shot to his feet, his heart pounding. "Who's there?" he called out. No response. Then, from the shadows, something moved, a massive, hulking shape that ducked behind a tree faster than George's eyes could track. "What the hell was that?" Mike hissed, scrambling to his feet. "Pack up," George ordered. "We're leaving." They moved quickly, dousing the fire and shoving their gear into bags. The creature didn't approach, but they could feel it watching, its presence oppressive and unmistakable. As they started down the trail toward their car, the rain turned heavier, the muddy path slick beneath their boots. George took the lead, flashlight cutting through the downpour. Behind him, the others whispered nervously, their voices barely audible over the rain. Then, from somewhere ahead, came a deafening slam. It sounded like a tree being felled, the crash reverberating through the forest. "Run!" George shouted, adrenaline surging. They bolted down the trail, slipping and sliding in the mud. The creature pursued them, its heavy footsteps crashing through the undergrowth. George didn't dare look back, his focus entirely on keeping his footing and guiding the group. Julia screamed as she stumbled, but George grabbed her arm, pulling her upright. "Come on," he urged. The trail twisted and turned, the forest seeming to close in around them. George's mind raced. He thought of his dad again, what he would have done in a situation like this. Stay calm, think it through. The creature let out a bone-chilling howl, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the trees. George pushed the others forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Finally, they broke through the tree line and onto the outskirts of a small town. The lights of a gas station glowed faintly in the distance. The group staggered toward it, drenched and exhausted. They burst into the gas station, startling the clerk behind the counter. "Call the police," George said, his voice hoarse. The clerk stared at them, wide-eyed, but nodded and reached for the phone. As they waited for the authorities, George couldn't shake the image of the creature from his mind. Its massive form, the way it moved with a predatory intelligence. He didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing for certain. They'd barely escaped with their lives. The cabin sat on the edge of the woods, a solitary structure tucked into the snowy embrace of the Ozark Mountains. The wind howled relentlessly outside, shaking the bare trees and battering the windows with icy gusts. Nick Crow stood in the small kitchen, his breath visible in the chilly air. The fire in the main room had dwindled to embers, and the drafty old cabin didn't do much to keep out the winter cold. Nick had lived in Detroit most of his life, where winter was a beast of its own. He'd spent his days working as a gardener, turning lifeless patches of earth into vibrant displays of color. It was an unusual career in a city known for its concrete and steel, but Nick had always felt at home with his hands in the dirt, coaxing life out of unlikely places. This cabin retreat, however, was far removed from the familiar bustle of the city. "Do you think the wind'll let up?" said Ellie, one of his friends, as she threw another log onto the fire. "Not anytime soon," Nick replied, glancing out the frosted window. The night was pitch black, the trees swaying wildly in the gale. "Good thing we're not going anywhere," muttered Jake, lounging on the couch with a blanket wrapped around him. "This place gives me the creeps." "It's just the isolation," Nick said, though he felt it too. The mountains were beautiful in their starkness, but they had a way of making you feel small, insignificant. The group had come here for a quiet getaway, a break from their hectic lives, but the sense of peace they'd hoped for had been elusive. The wind had been relentless since their arrival, and the cabin felt like it was barely holding together. As they sat by the fire, Nick's thoughts drifted to his childhood. He remembered his grandmother's stories, told in her tiny living room back in Detroit. She'd had a way of making even the most ordinary tales feel magical, weaving in bits of folklore and superstition. "Did you hear that?" Ellie's voice snapped Nick out of his reverie. The room went silent. For a moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. Then, faint but distinct, came a scratching noise from outside. "Probably a branch," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. Nick got up and grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter. "I'll check it out." "Wait, are you sure?" Ellie asked, her voice tinged with unease. "I'll be quick." Nick stepped outside, the cold biting through his jacket. The wind whipped at his face as he shone the flashlight around the front of the cabin. The snow-covered ground was undisturbed, no footprints or fallen branches in sight. But then, just as he was about to head back inside, the beam of the flashlight caught something, a glint of movement among the trees. "Hello?" he called, his voice swallowed by the wind. There was no response, but he could feel it now, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. He backed toward the door, keeping the light trained on the spot where he'd seen movement. Suddenly, something slammed against the side of the cabin. The impact rattled the walls, sending a shiver through the wooden frame. Nick bolted inside, slamming the door behind him. "What the hell was that?" Jake demanded, jumping to his feet. "Something's out there," Nick said, his heart pounding. The scratching noise started again, louder this time. It moved along the side of the cabin, as though circling them. The group huddled together, their eyes darting toward the windows. "It's just an animal," Ellie said, though she didn't sound convinced. Nick didn't reply. He'd seen something out there, something that didn't move like any animal he'd ever encountered. He thought back to a series of videos he'd watched a few months ago, grainy footage of supposed creature sightings, stories of people disappearing in the woods. He dismissed them at the time as internet nonsense, but now... The night wore on, the noises outside growing more insistent. Scratching turned to pounding, and once they heard what sounded like a low growl. "Do we have any weapons?" Jake asked. "I've got a knife," Nick said, "and there's a hatchet by the woodpile." "We're not going out there," Ellie said firmly. They waited, huddled by the fire as the hours crawled by. Nick kept his knife close, his mind racing with plans. Could they make a run for it? The car was parked down the hill, but the snow was deep, and the road was treacherous. As dawn approached, the creature grew bolder. It slammed against the door with enough force to crack the wood, and the growl came again, louder and more guttural. "We can't stay here," Nick said. "We'll make a break for the car." The group moved quickly, bundling up against the cold and grabbing what they could. Nick led the way, his flashlight cutting through the dim light of early morning. The creature didn't let them go easily. As they descended the hill, they heard it crashing through the undergrowth, its guttural growls echoing through the trees. Nick turned once and caught a glimpse of it, a massive, hunched figure with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. Ellie stumbled, but Nick grabbed her arm, pulling her upright. "Keep moving," he urged. When they finally reached the car, Nick fumbled with the keys, his hands numb from the cold. The creature was close now, its heavy footsteps pounding through the snow. Come on," Jake muttered, glancing over his shoulder. The engine roared to life, and they piled in just as the creature burst into view. It slammed against the car, rocking it violently, but Nick didn't wait. He floored the gas, the tires spinning for a moment before finding traction. As they sped down the snow-covered road, Nick didn't look back. The creature's silhouette lingered in the rearview mirror for a moment before disappearing into the trees. It wasn't until they reached the main road and flagged down a passing truck that Nick allowed himself to breathe. They told the driver about the creature, though he looked skeptical. Nick didn't care. All that mattered was that they'd made it out alive. The breeze sweeping through the Blue Ridge Mountains carried a faint, cool edge, a reminder of the unpredictable nature of spring. John Russell stood on the edge of the small, placid lake, his fishing rod in hand. The mountains loomed around them, their ridges a patchwork of budding green and rocky outcroppings. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. John had spent most of his life in Chicago, a place defined by its relentless energy and industrial grit. He worked as a lumberjack in the city outskirts, where the forested preserves offered a semblance of wilderness amidst the urban sprawl. The noise, the pace, and the constant hum of life in Chicago were worlds away from the stillness of this mountain retreat. The fishing trip had been Jake's idea. Jake was the kind of guy who always wanted to escape into nature, dragging his friends along for some adventure or another. Along with Ellie and Mason, the four of them had set up camp near the lake. The day had been spent fishing, swapping stories, and roasting their modest catch over an open fire. As night fell, the wind picked up. It whistled through the trees, tugging at the flames of their campfire. They huddled around the warmth, their laughter softened by the encroaching darkness. "You ever think about how quiet it gets out here?" Ellie asked, her voice low. "Like, too quiet?" "It's just the mountains," Mason replied. "Sound gets swallowed up by the trees." John poked at the fire with a stick, watching the embers flare. Something about Ellie's comment gnawed at him. The quiet was oppressive, as if the world was holding its breath. Then it came, the noise. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, but deeper, more resonant. It echoed through the woods, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "What the hell was that?" Jake said, sitting up straight. John turned toward the direction of the sound, his eyes straining to pierce the shadows. "Probably an animal," he said, though he didn't believe it. Another noise followed, a crashing through the underbrush, heavy and deliberate. It sounded like something large moving through the trees. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Mason grabbed the hatchet he'd been using to chop wood, while Jake pulled a hunting knife from his pack. "Stay close to the fire," John said, his voice firm. The wind whipped through the campsite, carrying with it the faintest whiff of something foul, like rotting meat. Then, silence. The stillness stretched on, broken only by the crackling of the fire. But just as they began to relax, the growl came again, closer this time. And then they saw it. A massive, shadowy figure loomed at the edge of the firelight. It was tall, its shoulders impossibly broad, covered in dark, matted hair. Its eyes glinted in the firelight, reflecting an eerie, reddish glow. "Oh my God," Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. The creature didn't move, but its presence was oppressive, filling the air with a palpable sense of dread. John had never seen or heard anything like it before. He'd heard tales of bears, mountain lions, even wolves. But this was something else. The moment shattered when the creature let out an ear-splitting roar, charging forward with terrifying speed. "Run!" John shouted. They scattered, the firelight swallowed by the darkness as they plunged into the woods. John's heart pounded in his chest as he ran, the sound of crashing branches and heavy footsteps behind him. He could hear Ellie screaming, Jake shouting something incomprehensible. Then, a terrible, wet sound. A scream cut short. "Jake!" John called, skidding to a halt. But there was no answer. The creature let out another roar, and John forced himself to move, his lungs burning as he pushed through the thick underbrush. He caught up with Ellie and Mason near a rocky outcropping. "We have to keep moving," he panted. "We can't just leave him." Ellie sobbed. John grabbed her by the shoulders, his voice firm. "If we go back, we'll die too." They moved as silently as they could, the wind masking their footsteps. The creature's growls echoed through the woods, distant but relentless. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes, it was impossible to tell. The wind howled and the forest seemed to close in around them. They stumbled across an old, overgrown trail and followed it, hoping it would lead them to safety. Eventually, they saw lights, a small village nestled in the valley below. Relief surged through them as they hurried toward it, their legs trembling with exhaustion. When they finally reached the outskirts of the village, John collapsed onto the ground, his chest heaving. A local man emerged from one of the houses, alarmed by their disheveled appearance. "What happened?" he asked. John looked up at him, his eyes haunted. "There's something in the woods, something that shouldn't be." The woods in Maine felt different from the wilderness John Mortensen was used to. He had grown up in Detroit, where nature was more a concept than a reality. Small parks and overgrown lots sandwiched between rows of buildings. But as an IT specialist with a demanding schedule, he found solace in the occasional escape to the outdoors, a contrast to the hours spent staring at screens in dimly lit offices. The rustling leaves and crisp autumn air were a reminder of a world untouched by circuits and code. This camping trip was meant to be a solitary retreat, a chance to unplug and recharge. John had picked a secluded area near an old hiking trail. The trees stood tall and densely packed, their fiery red and gold leaves shedding steadily to form a thick carpet on the forest floor. He spent his days fishing at a nearby stream and reading by the fire at night, the crackling flames his only company. On the third evening, the rain came. It started as a drizzle, pattering softly against his tent, then swelled into a steady downpour. He sat under the tarp he'd rigged above his campfire, staring into the flames. The rhythmic sound of rain hitting leaves was soothing, almost hypnotic, but it was broken by something else, a sound that didn't belong. A sharp crack like a branch snapping underfoot. John froze, his ears straining. The firelight illuminated the immediate area, but beyond it, the woods were an impenetrable black void. He reached for the hunting knife strapped to his belt, the weight of it suddenly comforting. Another sound came, a rustling, deliberate and slow, like something moving just outside the circle of light. "Hello?" he called out, his voice steady but laced with unease. There was no response, only the rain and the occasional crack of a branch. He told himself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon, but something gnawed at him, a primal sense of being watched. Then he saw it. A shadow moved behind a tree, just at the edge of the firelight. It was tall, impossibly so, with long, angular limbs that didn't seem to belong to any creature he could name. It didn't move like an animal either. There was an unnatural stillness to it, like it was deliberately waiting. John's mind raced. He remembered an old TV show he'd watched, one of those paranormal investigation series. They'd talked about strange sightings in Maine, unexplained creatures lurking in the woods, watching from the shadows. He'd dismissed it as entertainment at the time, but now, staring at the figure behind the tree, he wasn't so sure. The shadow shifted, stepping slightly into the light. John caught a glimpse of its face, or what passed for a face. It was pale and elongated, with deep, hollow sockets where its eyes should have been. A jagged line ran across its head, almost like a scar or a grin. He felt his stomach churn. Without thinking, he grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the figure. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, but by the time it reached the tree, the figure was gone. Panic set in. He packed his essentials as quickly as he could, shoving his gear into his pack. The fire still burned behind him, casting flickering shadows that seemed to dance and stretch in unnatural ways. He decided to leave it. There was no time to put it out. The rain made the forest floor slippery, and the darkness was absolute outside the fire's glow. He moved cautiously, his flashlight sweeping the path ahead. Every sound made him jump. The crunch of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the relentless drumming of the rain. He felt exposed, vulnerable. Then the attack came. It happened so fast, he barely registered it. A blur of movement, a heavy impact. He was thrown to the ground, his flashlight skittering away and plunging the world into darkness. The creature loomed above him, its form even more horrifying up close. He swung his knife blindly, feeling the blade connect with something solid. The creature let out a guttural, inhuman scream and recoiled. John scrambled to his feet, grabbing his flashlight and running. His heart pounded, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away. The creature was behind him. He could hear its guttural breathing, the crunch of its footsteps. He found a dense thicket and dove into it, crouching low and holding his breath. The creature passed by, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. He stayed there, motionless, until the sounds faded into the distance. When he finally emerged, he moved with painstaking care, his flashlight off to avoid drawing attention. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but the woods were still treacherous. He thought of his family back in Detroit, his mother's smile, his father's gruff laugh. He clung to those memories, using them to steel himself. Eventually, he stumbled upon an old dirt road. He followed it, his steps quickening as he saw headlights in the distance. A pickup truck rumbled toward him, and he waved it down, relief flooding him as the driver stopped. "What the hell happened to you?" the man asked, his eyes wide. "There's something in the woods," John said, his voice shaking. "We need to go, now." The driver didn't ask any more questions. He just nodded, and John climbed into the truck. As they drove away, he looked back at the forest, half expecting to see the creature standing at the edge of the road, watching. But there was nothing, only the trees, silent and dark. Nick Norris had always loved the open road. As a delivery driver based out of Denver, the expansive skies and winding mountain highways had long been his backdrop. Denver had taught him to appreciate the beauty of nature, but also its unpredictability. He had learned that even a seemingly serene landscape could turn treacherous in an instant, a lesson he would never forget after his journey through Louisiana. The road trip had started as a casual escape, an opportunity to step away from work and the routines of urban life. Spring had transformed the Louisiana bayous into a lush green maze, vibrant and teeming with life. Nick had been drawn to the idea of exploring the deep South, far removed from the chill of Denver's early spring. He wanted to soak in the region's charm, its folklore, and its haunting beauty. By late afternoon, he had ventured into a secluded area near a stretch of swampy woodland. The weather had taken on a dreary cast. Thick clouds hung low in the sky, and the air felt heavy with the promise of rain. Parking his car near an old dirt trail, Nick grabbed a small pack containing water, a flashlight, a knife, and his phone. Though reception had been spotty since he'd arrived, He told himself it would just be a quick walk to stretch his legs, but the trail seemed to beckon him further with every step. Tall cypress trees rose like sentinels, their gnarled roots twisting into the murky water. The stillness was both calming and eerie. Occasionally, the cry of a bird or the croak of a frog punctuated the silence. Then the silence deepened. Nick paused, a chill prickling the back of his neck. It wasn't just quiet. It was unnatural, as if the swamp itself had stopped breathing. He scanned the trees, the underbrush, searching for the source of his unease. That's when he saw it, or thought he did. Something large crouched behind a tree, partially obscured. Its shape was hard to define, but it seemed hunched, its limbs long and oddly jointed. Nick froze, his mind racing. Could it be a bear? A person? No, it moved differently. Too fluid, too deliberate. The figure shifted slightly, and Nick caught a glint of something. Eyes. They were reflective, almost luminous, and locked onto him with an intensity that made his stomach churn. Nick took a step back, then another, trying to convince himself it was just an animal. But as he turned to head back toward his car, he heard movement behind him. Leaves rustled. A low, guttural sound like a growl rippled through the air. His pace quickened, his heart hammering in his chest. By the time he reached his car, night was falling fast, and the clouds had deepened into an ominous gray. He fumbled for his keys, glancing back over his shoulder. The trail was empty, but the sensation of being watched clung to him. Nick started the car and drove to a nearby clearing where he had seen signs for a campground earlier in the day. There, he found a small fire pit and decided to settle in for the night. The idea of driving through the swampy backroads in the dark didn't appeal to him, not with the memory of those eyes burned into his mind. As he lit the fire, the flames cast dancing shadows across the surrounding trees. He tried to shake off his unease, telling himself it was all in his head. To distract himself, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through old YouTube videos he'd downloaded. One, in particular, caught his attention, a documentary about unidentified creatures and cryptids. Nick couldn't help but draw parallels between the stories and what he'd seen earlier. Some accounts described creatures that stalked their prey, concealing themselves and watching from the shadows before attacking. He shivered, though the air around the fire was warm. His thoughts drifted to his family back in Denver. His sister had always teased him for being a workaholic, but she would have laughed at his current predicament, probably calling him paranoid. He missed her. Missed their Sunday dinners where she'd try to force him to eat kale salads while he stuck to steak. A sudden snap of a branch yanked him back to the present. Nick's eyes darted toward the sound. The fire crackled, its light failing to penetrate the thick darkness beyond the trees. Then it came, the growl, low, menacing, and close. Nick grabbed his knife, his pulse racing. The growl grew louder, and suddenly the creature emerged from the shadows. It was massive, its body impossibly thin yet muscular, its face a grotesque blend of human and beast. Its eyes glowed with that same eerie light, and its mouth twisted into a snarl. Nick didn't wait to see what it would do. He bolted, abandoning the fire and heading toward what he hoped was the main road. The creature pursued him, its movements unnervingly fast. The rain began to fall, soaking Nick as he ran through the swampy terrain. The ground was slick, the roots of trees threatening to trip him with every step. He heard the creature crashing through the underbrush behind him, its growls growing closer. Nick's lungs burned, his legs screaming for relief, but he couldn't stop. Finally, he saw the faint glow of lights in the distance. A small village, or perhaps a gas station. Summoning every ounce of strength, he sprinted toward it. As he broke through the tree line and onto the pavement, the creature stopped. It stood at the edge of the forest, its glowing eyes fixed on him. For a moment, Nick thought it might follow, but it seemed unwilling to step into the open. He stumbled into the nearest building, collapsing onto the floor. The locals stared at him, wide-eyed as he gasped for air. "Something's out there," he managed to choke out. No one believed him, of course, but Nick knew what he had seen, and he would never forget those eyes watching him from the shadows. Sean Winchester had always loved the wide, open spaces of his home state of Texas. The sprawling highways and big skies had been both a comfort and a workplace as he delivered packages to towns and ranches. Growing up in such a vast landscape, Sean had developed a healthy respect for the wilderness and its dangers. It was that respect and an inkling of unease that followed him into Montana's frozen expanses during a winter road trip with friends. They had planned the trip as an escape from routine, a chance to experience the raw beauty of Montana's mountains and valleys in the stark quiet of winter. The promise of snow-covered forests and isolation had sounded like a dream to Sean, who spent most of his days weaving through urban sprawl. Yet, as the group drove deeper into the remote regions, the dream began to feel more like a warning. The wind had been howling since they crossed into a dense forest, a reminder that Montana's winters weren't kind. Storm clouds churned in the sky, heavy with snow that seemed ready to fall at any moment. The group parked their car at the edge of a trail leading into the woods, deciding to explore before nightfall. Sean carried a pack with essentials: a flashlight, water, a hatchet, and a knife. His years of delivery driving had taught him to be practical, though he wondered if any of it would truly help in the wilderness. As they trudged through the snow, the forest seemed unnervingly quiet. The wind whispered through the trees, but even the sounds of wildlife were sparse. It wasn't long before Sean noticed tracks in the snow. At first, they looked like deer prints, but something about their shape was off, elongated as if the creature had a strange gait. "Probably just an animal," Sean muttered, though his stomach twisted. His friends nodded, their laughter forced as they tried to shake off the creeping unease. They hadn't gone much farther when the feeling of being watched settled over them. Sean stopped and scanned the woods, his breath visible in the icy air. Between the trees, he caught a glimpse of movement, too quick to identify, but large. The others saw it too, their chatter fading into silence. "What the hell was that?" one of them whispered. Sean's heart pounded. The figure had been upright, but its proportions were wrong, its arms too long, its posture slightly hunched. He thought of a video he'd seen on YouTube, a documentary about skinwalkers, creatures from Navajo legend that could mimic human voices and take on animal forms. Though the lore was tied to the Southwest, the resemblance sent a shiver down his spine. As they turned back toward the car, the figure began to follow, staying just out of sight. It moved with an uncanny silence, darting from tree to tree. By the time they reached the clearing where they'd parked, the storm had arrived. Snow began to fall in heavy flakes, obscuring the path and muffling sound. They decided to stay near the car, lighting a fire to keep warm while they waited for the storm to pass. Sean sat close to the flames, his eyes scanning the woods. His thoughts wandered to his family in Texas. His mother, who had always warned him about venturing too far into the unknown, and his younger brother, who would have thought this whole trip was the coolest thing ever. A loud crack interrupted his thoughts. The group turned toward the sound, their flashlights piercing the darkness. A tree limb had fallen, but the cause wasn't clear. Then they saw it, just at the edge of the firelight. The creature stood partially obscured by a tree, its shape more distinct now. It was tall, with a gaunt, almost skeletal frame. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light of the fire. Sean's breath caught in his throat as it moved closer, its gait unnatural, its limbs contorting as if it were still learning how to walk. Panic set in. "Get to the car!" Sean yelled, but the snow had piled high and the vehicle was partially buried. They grabbed what they could and ran into the woods, hoping to lose the creature in the storm. The wind howled around them and visibility was nearly zero. Sean led the way, lighting his flashlight, cutting a narrow path through the snow. The creature's growls echoed behind them, low and guttural, seeming to come from all directions at once. When one of his friends slipped and fell, Sean turned back to help. But before he could reach them, the creature lunged from the shadows. The scream that followed was short-lived, swallowed by the storm. The remaining group didn't stop. They moved silently, clinging to the shadows as they tried to outmaneuver the creature. Sean's mind raced, replaying every video he'd ever watched about survival. His boots sank into the snow with every step, the cold biting at his exposed skin. Hours seemed to pass as they trudged through the forest, the creature's presence always just behind them. When they finally saw the faint glow of a highway, relief flooded through Sean. They emerged from the woods, waving down the first car they saw. The driver, a trucker, pulled over and helped them inside. As they explained what had happened, Sean glanced back at the forest. The creature stood at the edge, its glowing eyes the last thing he saw before the truck sped away. Sean knew he would never forget that night. The storm, the loss of his friend, and those eyes watching from the darkness would haunt him forever. The forest stretched endlessly before Chuck Davidson, a sea of green and shadows that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. He had agreed to join his friends for a hike through the wooded trails of Maine. A place they had all heard was beautiful this time of year. Though Chuck was more accustomed to the wide-open skies and rugged mountains near Denver, where he worked as a mechanic, the allure of Maine's dense wilderness was too enticing to pass up. He liked a challenge, and the isolation sounded refreshing. The day began under a clear blue sky, the summer sun dappling the forest floor with patches of golden light. Chuck and his friends, Ben, Carla, and Lila, started their hike early, the crisp morning air filled with the scent of pine and earth. They carried light packs with supplies for the day, water, snacks, and a few basic tools. Chuck, ever the practical one, had also brought a sturdy multi-tool, a small hatchet, and a flashlight. The trails were well marked at first, winding through groves of towering trees and alongside a gentle stream. But as they ventured deeper, the path became less defined. Chuck noticed the silence creeping in. The usual sounds of birds and insects faded, replaced by an eerie stillness that set his nerves on edge. By the time they stopped for lunch near a small clearing, the wind had picked up, rustling the treetops and carrying with it an uneasy feeling. As they ate, Chuck's mind wandered to the rumors he'd heard about the area. Tales of strange creatures lurking in the woods had circulated among locals for decades. Some said they were spirits, others swore they were cryptids, unexplained entities that defied logic. Chuck wasn't one to believe in tall tales, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they weren't alone. The first encounter happened as they packed up to move on. Carla froze, her eyes fixed on the tree line. "Did you see that?" she whispered. The others followed her gaze, but all they saw were shadows. Chuck's pulse quickened. He had glimpsed something earlier, a flash of movement, low to the ground, but had dismissed it as a deer or a fox. Now he wasn't so sure. "Probably just an animal," Ben said, though his voice wavered. The group pressed on, the trail now barely discernible. The wind grew stronger, whipping through the trees with a mournful howl. Shadows danced along the forest floor, playing tricks on their eyes. Then it came again. Movement, this time accompanied by a low growl. Chuck turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the hatchet at his belt. The others huddled close, their eyes darting in all directions. "Whatever it is, it's following us," Chuck said, his voice low. The growl grew louder, and the creature emerged briefly from the shadows. It was unlike anything Chuck had ever seen. Hunched and angular, its skin pale and stretched taut over its frame. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and its movements were jerky, almost insect-like. "Run!" Chuck shouted, and they bolted down the trail. They ran until their lungs burned, the wind tearing at their clothes and the forest closing in around them. The creature's growls faded, but its presence lingered, a suffocating weight that pressed down on them. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, the sun had dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows over the forest. Chuck knew they couldn't make it back to the car before nightfall. They would have to set up camp and wait until morning. Reluctantly, they gathered wood and lit a fire in a small clearing. The flames cast flickering light on their anxious faces as they huddled together, weapons close at hand. Chuck kept the hatchet within reach, his knuckles white as he gripped it. The night was restless. The wind howled through the trees, masking the sounds of the creature that continued to stalk them. Chuck's thoughts drifted to his family, his sister back in Denver who had always teased him about his adventurous spirit, and his father who had taught him how to handle tools and face challenges head-on. He wondered if they would ever see him again. Sometime after midnight, the creature attacked. It lunged from the shadows, its jagged teeth bared. The group scattered, each grabbing what they could and fleeing into the darkness. Chuck ran blindly, his heart pounding as he navigated the treacherous terrain. The creature pursued them, its growls echoing through the forest. Chuck heard a scream, Lila's, and then silence. His stomach twisted, but he couldn't stop. He moved as quietly as he could, sticking to the shadows and avoiding open spaces. By dawn, Chuck and Ben were the only ones left. They stumbled onto a dirt road, their clothes torn and their faces pale with exhaustion. A truck appeared in the distance, its headlights cutting through the early morning mist. They flagged it down, and the driver, an older man with a weathered face, helped them into the cab. As they explained what had happened, Chuck glanced back at the forest. The creature was gone, but its presence lingered in his mind. He knew he would never forget the terror of that night, nor the friends he had lost to the shadows. The desert seemed endless, a canvas of russet sands and jagged rocks stretching beneath the Arizona sun. Nick Johnson, a man who had spent most of his life in Los Angeles, was used to a different kind of heat, the thick, smoggy air clinging to the city streets. But out here, the air was dry, the kind that parched your throat with every breath. Nick wasn't one to shy away from manual labor. His hands were calloused from years of blue-collar work, and the idea of a hike in the desert didn't faze him. At least, not at first. He and 3 friends, Carlos, Mia, and Trent, had decided to take a break from their day-to-day routines and explore one of Arizona's lesser-known trails. The path wound through rocky outcrops, its edges crumbling into steep drops. Cacti dotted the landscape, their sharp spines a warning to keep your distance. The day began uneventfully. The sky was an unbroken stretch of blue, and the heat wasn't yet oppressive. They joked as they walked, their laughter bouncing off the canyon walls. Nick found himself thinking of his family back in LA. His sister's knack for storytelling, his dad's endless advice on staying prepared. He chuckled, wondering what they'd say about him trekking through the desert with a group of friends. By midday, the heat had intensified, and the group stopped in the shade of a rocky overhang to rest. Nick had packed light, as always. A bottle of water, a knife, a small flashlight, and a multi-tool. He wasn't one to over-prepare, but he liked having the essentials on hand. The first sign of trouble came as they resumed their hike. The air, calm and still all morning, felt heavier now. It wasn't the heat, it was something else, a prickling sensation at the back of Nick's neck. "Do you feel that?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feel what?" Trent replied, though his tone betrayed his unease. "Like we're being watched," she said. Nick scanned the horizon. The desert was vast and open, with no obvious place for anything or anyone to hide. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling. His mind wandered to a TV show he'd watched about wendigos, the creatures of Native American folklore said to be cursed spirits of insatiable hunger. The idea seemed absurd in the harsh light of day, but something about the quietness of the desert made it hard to dismiss. Then they heard it. A soft, scraping sound, like claws against stone. "Did you hear that?" Carlos asked, his voice tight. "Probably an animal," Nick said, though he wasn't convinced. The sound came again, closer this time. The group fell silent, their eyes darting toward the source of the noise. Something moved in the shadows beneath a nearby rock formation, a flash of pale, emaciated limbs and hollow eyes that sent a chill down Nick's spine. "Run," Nick whispered. They bolted down the trail, the creature's guttural growls echoing behind them. Nick's heart pounded as he navigated the uneven path, his boots kicking up clouds of dust. He didn't look back. He didn't dare. When they finally stopped to catch their breath, the sun was dipping low in the sky. The creature was gone, but the oppressive feeling of being watched lingered. Nick's mind raced. He thought of his dad's advice. Always know your way out. But out here, the trails blurred into one another, and landmarks were hard to distinguish. They moved cautiously, speaking in hushed tones. The creature stalked them from the shadows, its movements just out of sight. At one point, it let out a low, mournful wail that froze them in their tracks. Nick gripped his knife, his knuckles white. "Keep moving," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. They continued in silence, every rustle of the wind and crack of a twig setting their nerves on edge. As night fell, they huddled around a small fire in a shallow ravine. The flames flickered, casting eerie shadows on the rock walls. Nick's thoughts drifted again to his family. His sister would have loved this. A real-life horror story to weave into her tales. His dad would have scolded him for not carrying a map or a compass. The creature attacked just before dawn. It was a blur of pale limbs and razor-sharp teeth, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Carlos was the first to react, swinging a branch he'd picked up earlier. The creature shrieked and retreated, but it was clear they wouldn't be safe for long. "Go!" Nick shouted, and they ran once more, their footsteps echoing in the canyon. The trail narrowed, forcing them to move single file. Nick stayed at the back, his knife drawn. The creature followed, its growls growing louder. By the time they reached the edge of the trail, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. The creature didn't follow them into the open, disappearing into the shadows like a nightmare fading with the morning light. They stumbled into a small town, their clothes torn and their faces pale. The locals listened to their story with skeptical expressions, but Nick didn't care. He knew what he had seen, and he knew he would never forget the terror of that day in the Arizona desert. Chuck Cage had been behind the wheel of his 18-wheeler for most of his life. The hum of the highway, the hiss of air brakes, and the wide-open spaces of the road were more familiar to him than any fixed address. Born and raised in Los Angeles, he had grown used to the urban chaos, dodging rush-hour traffic, the endless sun glinting off car hoods, and the smog that always seemed to blur the skyline. When he wasn't working, Chuck liked to tinker with his classic car, a '72 Chevelle he'd rebuilt from the ground up. That, and the company of his dog, Scout, a wiry mutt with a knack for sniffing out trouble, made up the better part of his world. It was supposed to be a simple detour. Chuck had planned to meet up with some friends at a remote cabin nestled deep in the Appalachian woods, a few days of peace before the Christmas rush on the roads. The cabin was as picturesque as the postcards promised, a rustic wooden structure surrounded by snow-dusted pines, with the kind of stillness that city folk paid good money to experience. The day started off sunny, with crisp air and a faint breeze carrying the promise of a storm far off. Chuck's friends had arrived before him and the group settled in quickly. By late afternoon, they had a fire roaring in the stone hearth and a pot of chili simmering on the stove. Ever Curious had already explored every corner of the cabin, returning to Chuck's side with a wagging tail and a dusting of snow on his nose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in long, creeping shadows, a strange tension seemed to settle over the group. It was subtle at first, a faint unease that no one could quite name. They chalked it up to the isolation or the eerie quiet that came with being so far from civilization. But Chuck, always attuned to his dog's moods, noticed Scout's unusual restlessness. The mutt would growl softly at the windows, his hackles raised, his nose pressed against the glass as if sensing something in the darkness. Around the fire, the group tried to shake off the unease. Someone cracked a joke and the conversation shifted to lighter topics: movies, holiday plans, Chuck's stories from the road. Chuck mentioned a low-budget horror flick he'd seen about a creature stalking hikers in the woods. The thing was never fully shown, he said, poking at the fire with a stick. Just shadows and noises. Sometimes that's scarier than seeing it head-on. The words hung in the air longer than anyone expected. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees like a wounded animal, and then came the noise, a sharp, deliberate scratching against the cabin's front door. The group froze. Scout barked, his deep, guttural sound reverberating through the small space. Chuck grabbed a flashlight and moved to the door, signaling for everyone to stay back. He swung it open to reveal nothing. Just the empty clearing, the snow untouched save for the tracks they had left earlier. But Chuck couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. He scanned the edge of the forest, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. For a split second, he thought he saw something. Movement among the trees, faster than his eyes could follow. When he turned back to the group, his face betrayed the unease he tried to mask with a shrug. The scratching returned, this time at the back of the cabin. Someone screamed, and the group scrambled to secure the windows and doors. Scout was barking wildly now, his teeth bared at something unseen. Chuck armed himself with a tire iron from his truck's toolkit. Whatever it was testing them, circling the cabin, moving too fast and too deliberately to be a bear or any animal they could name. When the creature finally revealed itself, it was fleeting. A blur of pale, elongated limbs darting past the window, accompanied by an unearthly screech that made their blood run cold. It didn't attack outright, but seemed to revel in their fear, its silhouette lingering just at the edge of the firelight. "We can't stay here," Chuck said, his voice steady but low. "It's toying with us." The group agreed, hastily gathering their belongings. Chuck led the way, Scout sticking close to his side, growling at the dark. They moved quickly and quietly through the woods, following the faint trail they'd driven in on. The forest seemed alive with sounds, the crunch of snow, the rustling of branches, the guttural growls and clicking noises that seemed to follow them. Suddenly, the creature struck. It didn't fully emerge, but lashed out from the shadows, clawing at one of Chuck's friends who screamed and stumbled. Chuck swung the tire iron wildly, forcing the thing back into the darkness. They didn't stop to check the wound, dragging their injured friend along as they sprinted toward the clearing where Chuck's truck was parked. The truck was covered in frost, its engine cold from hours of disuse. Chuck threw open the door, urging everyone inside as he fumbled with the keys. Scout leaped into the passenger seat, barking at the unseen menace that still lingered in the shadows. The engine roared to life, and Chuck gunned it, the tires spinning briefly on the icy ground before catching traction. As they sped down the narrow forest road, the creature gave chase, its pale form barely visible in the truck's rearview mirror. It was fast, inhumanly so, but the truck was faster. They broke through the tree line onto the main road, and the creature stopped its pursuit, disappearing back into the woods with a final bone-chilling screech. Back in the safety of a nearby town, they called for help. Chuck's friend was treated for his wounds, and the group agreed to leave the cabin's mysteries behind. But Chuck knew he'd never forget the creature's eyes, or the way it had watched them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Sam Johnson never thought he'd leave the gyms of Poughkeepsie behind for a quiet weekend fishing trip in Maine. But when his friends insisted it would be the perfect way to unwind, he couldn't say no. He had spent years training for fights, the adrenaline of the cage now as familiar to him as the hum of his custom-built computer at home. The woods and waters of Maine, though, were a different world entirely, far removed from the buzzing town where he grew up. Still, the thought of the fresh air, the company of friends, and his loyal dog Rocco by his side was enough to convince him. The group drove deep into the wilderness, where the road narrowed and the cell service vanished. They reached the lake by late afternoon, the water calm and glassy under a cloudy sky. Tall pines surrounded the area, their silhouettes jagged against the fading light. Sam parked the car and Rocco leapt out, sniffing the ground eagerly. "Looks like we've got the place to ourselves," one of Sam's friends remarked. They set up camp not far from the shore, a fire crackling to life as night crept in. The smell of grilled fish and smoke mingled with the earthy aroma of the woods. Stories flowed easily around the fire, most of them lighthearted and filled with laughter. But as the sky darkened further, someone brought up local legends. "Ever hear of the Dogmen?" one of the guys asked. Sam had read about it once in one of those lurid yellow newspapers he'd picked up for fun during a late-night gas station run. The article described a half-man, half-dog creature said to roam the forests of North America, especially around the Great Lakes and nearby regions. Skeptical, he dismissed it as urban legend at the time. "They say it watches," the storyteller continued. "You won't hear it coming. It just stares, waiting for the right moment." The group laughed nervously, brushing off the tale as nothing more than campfire fodder. Sam's MMA training had taught him to rely on what he could see and feel, not on tall tales. Still, he couldn't ignore the way Rocco seemed unusually alert, his ears perked and his body tense. As the fire burned low, they decided to turn in for the night. The group set up their tents while Sam chose to stay out a bit longer and began tossing another log on the fire. Rocco sat beside him, staring into the woods. That's when Sam noticed it, a pair of reflective eyes glinting in the firelight, just beyond the trees. At first, he thought it might be a deer, but the way the eyes held steady, unblinking, sent a chill down his spine. Slowly, he stood, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife on his belt. "Hey, anyone out there?" he called into the darkness. There was no reply, just the rustling of leaves and the faint sound of the lake lapping against the shore. Rocco growled low in his throat, his body rigid. The eyes disappeared, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Sam decided it was time to wake the others. Before he could take a step, a figure moved, something tall and unnaturally fast darting behind a tree. The firelight caught a fleeting glimpse of matted fur and elongated limbs, too large to belong to any animal Sam could name. "Guys!" he shouted. The group stumbled out of their tents, groggy and confused. "What's going on?" "There's something out there," Sam said, his voice firm. No one doubted him, especially after seeing Rocco's unwavering growl. They gathered closer to the fire, their weapons limited to a few hunting knives and the heft of a camping hatchet. The night dragged on, the creature never fully revealing itself. It circled them, the sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls keeping them on edge. Sam could swear he heard it breathe, a guttural, wet sound that sent a shiver through his entire body. Around midnight, the situation escalated. The creature lunged from the shadows, knocking one of Sam's friends to the ground. Sam reacted on instinct, rushing forward with the knife in hand. He managed to drive the blade into the creature's arm, or what he thought was its arm, before it recoiled, retreating back into the woods with an inhuman snarl. "We have to get out of here," Sam said, helping his injured friend to his feet. The group made a beeline for the car, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they stumbled over roots and rocks. Rocco barked furiously, running ahead and pausing to look back, as if urging them to hurry. They reached the car just as the creature emerged again, standing at the tree line. It didn't charge this time, but it didn't retreat either. Its glowing eyes locked on them, filled with something that felt uncomfortably like intelligence. Sam threw open the car door, ushering everyone inside. Rocco jumped in last, his tail wagging nervously as Sam started the engine. The headlights illuminated the creature for one horrifying moment. A hulking figure with a wolf-like face and unnaturally long limbs, its breath visible in the cool night air. Sam floored it, the tires kicking up gravel as they sped away. The creature didn't follow, but its presence lingered, an oppressive weight that wouldn't lift until they were miles away. They drove straight to the nearest town, where they reported the incident to the local authorities. Predictably, the story was met with skepticism, but Sam knew what he had seen. The Dogman wasn't just a story in some tabloid paper. It was real, and it was out there, watching. Arnold Cavell wasn't sure why he agreed to the hunting trip in the first place. Maybe it was the promise of crisp autumn air or the chance to finally put his tools down and swap the scent of motor oil for pine needles. Back in San Francisco, the hum of the city never stopped, and his days as a mechanic left little room for much else. His one escape was cooking. He loved the way ingredients could be transformed into something entirely new. But out here, in the heart of Wyoming's wilderness, there wasn't much to cook, only game to hunt. The group had set up camp at the edge of a dense forest, where the trees stood tall and bare branches clawed at the sky. The air was calm, cool but not freezing, with a faint smell of damp earth. They'd been there 2 days already, their mornings filled with tracking and their evenings spent around the fire, swapping stories over jerky and coffee. Arnold had heard of the Wendigo before. Growing up, he'd read about it in books and overheard the occasional creepy tale passed around campfires during family trips to Lake Tahoe. A spirit of insatiable hunger, the Wendigo was said to stalk the woods, possessing those who gave in to cannibalism or luring travelers to their doom. But that was folklore, just a story to keep kids from wandering too far. Or so he thought. It was their third day when things started to go wrong. They'd split into pairs, covering more ground in hopes of bringing down something worth the trek. Arnold and his friend Joel headed north, weaving through the thickening woods. It was quiet, too quiet, Arnold realized. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of the wind. "Feels weird out here," Joel muttered, adjusting the rifle on his shoulder. Arnold nodded, gripping his own rifle a little tighter. The calmness of the air was suffocating, pressing in on them like a held breath. That's when Arnold saw it, or thought he did. Just ahead, behind a cluster of skeletal trees, something moved. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to make him freeze. Joel noticed his hesitation. "What is it?" Joel whispered, his voice barely audible. Arnold shook his head. "Not sure. Could be a deer." But he didn't think it was. There had been something wrong with the way it moved. Too smooth, too deliberate. They continued on, but Arnold couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. Every so often, he'd catch a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The unease settled deep in his chest, growing heavier with each step. By late afternoon, they returned to camp empty-handed. The rest of the group had fared no better, and their shared disappointment did little to lift the oppressive mood. They sat around the fire as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the campsite. "I swear I saw something out there," Arnold said finally, breaking the silence. Joel nodded. "Same here. Thought it was an animal, but now I'm not so sure." The others dismissed it, blaming the nerves that often came with being deep in the wilderness. But as the night wore on, the tension around the fire became palpable. Routines felt strained, and even the jokes seemed half-hearted. Then, just as the fire's glow began to fade, a scream tore through the woods. It wasn't human. Arnold was sure of that, but it wasn't an animal either. It was high-pitched, shrill, and filled with something that made his stomach churn. Malice. The group grabbed their weapons and stood back to back, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. For a moment, there was nothing. Then from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was tall, unnaturally so. Its emaciated frame draped in ashen skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Antlers jutted from its skull-like head, and its eyes burned with an otherworldly light. It didn't move closer, but stood just at the edge of the firelight, watching them with an intensity that felt like knives against their skin. "That can't be real," one of Arnold's friends whispered, his voice trembling. Before anyone could react, the creature lunged. Its speed was blinding, and it was on them in seconds. Arnold barely had time to raise his rifle before it struck Joel, claws tearing through him like paper. Blood sprayed across the ground as Joel crumpled, lifeless. "Run!" Arnold shouted, firing a shot that barely grazed the creature. The group scattered, abandoning the fire and fleeing into the woods. Arnold's legs burned as he ran, branches whipping against his face. The creature was behind them, its guttural growls growing louder with each passing second. They regrouped near a rocky outcrop, panting and terrified. "We can't stay here," Arnold said. "It's playing with us." One of them pulled out a phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Desperation set in as the creature's growls drew closer. Arnold thought of his sister back in San Francisco, how she'd always teased him about his love for elaborate recipes. He'd give anything to be back in his tiny apartment, frying up something simple, safe. "We need to reach the road," he said. "It's our only chance." The group moved cautiously, sticking close together and using the cover of the trees to stay hidden. The creature followed, its glowing eyes visible through the branches. By some miracle, they reached the main road just as a pair of headlights appeared in the distance. Arnold waved frantically, relief washing over him as the car screeched to a halt. "Help us," he shouted, piling into the vehicle with the others. The driver didn't ask questions, speeding away as the creature watched from the tree line, its eyes burning like coals. Michael Mortensen was used to adrenaline. As a firefighter in Wichita, he had faced blazing infernos and situations most people would only see in movies. But nothing had prepared him for what he experienced on that fishing trip in the Adirondacks of New York State. The trip was supposed to be a break from the grind, a few days with his buddies in the crisp autumn air. The foliage was at its peak, the trees ablaze with shades of orange and red. The Adirondacks were nothing like Wichita's flat plains. Here, the world rose and fell in waves of rugged terrain, dense forests, and glittering lakes. Michael had always loved movies, especially thrillers and horror films. The trip reminded him of countless scenes he'd watched where characters ventured into the wilderness and faced things they couldn't explain. He'd even seen a documentary about Bigfoot once, the infamous cryptid rumored to roam the forests of North America. He and his friends had joked about it on the drive up, but the laughter had felt hollow against the vastness of the woods. Their cabin was modest, perched near a secluded lake, the kind of place where cell reception was a rumor. They spent the first day fishing, the calm water reflecting the fiery leaves in the sky, a soft gray that promised rain but never delivered. The air was cool, a slight breeze carrying the earthy scent of the forest. It was on the second day that things began to feel off. Michael noticed it first, the way the birds suddenly went silent around midday. The usual hum of the forest seemed muted, as though it were holding its breath. "You hear that?" Michael asked as they prepared their lines on the shore. "Hear what?" Tim, one of his friends, replied, not looking up. "Exactly," Michael said. "Nothing." Tim shrugged. "Just a quiet day. Relax, man." But Michael couldn't shake the unease. That night, as they sat around the campfire, the feeling grew. They roasted hot dogs on sticks and shared beers, the flames casting flickering shadows on their faces. The forest pressed in around them, dark and endless. Then, just beyond the firelight, Michael thought he saw movement, a shadow shifting between the trees. "You see that?" he asked, his voice low. "What now?" Tim groaned. "I swear, something's out there." The group turned to look, but the shadows were still. Jake, another friend, laughed. "You've been watching too many of those movies, man. Bigfoot's not real." But Michael wasn't so sure. He remembered stories he'd heard, campfire tales and strange accounts from hunters. Bigfoot, the elusive creature said to roam the wilderness, was often described as a massive, hairy being, almost human, but not quite. There were tales of it watching from the shadows, leaving enormous footprints in the mud, and even letting out bone-chilling screams that echoed through the trees. That night, Michael lay awake in his sleeping bag, listening. The cabin's walls felt thin against the vastness of the woods. He thought of his sister back in Wichita, how they used to watch horror movies together when they were kids. She'd always laugh at the scary parts, saying, "You know it's fake, right?" Michael wished he could believe that now. The next morning, they found tracks. They were massive, larger than any bear's, with toes that looked disturbingly human. The group stared in silence, their breath visible in the cool morning air. "Bear," Jake said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "No bear makes tracks like that," Michael said. The day passed in uneasy quiet. They fished, but the joy was gone, replaced by a constant feeling of being watched. Michael kept glancing over his shoulder, catching glimpses of movement he couldn't quite pin down. By evening, the tension was unbearable. As they sat around the fire, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Then, from the shadows came a low growl. "What the hell was that?" Tim whispered, his face pale in the firelight. Michael stood, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam landed on a figure, a hulking shape partially concealed behind a tree. It was massive, its outline unmistakably humanoid but covered in thick, dark fur. Its eyes caught the light, glowing faintly. "Run," Michael said, his voice barely audible. They bolted for the cabin, the fire still burning behind them. Inside, they barricaded the door and windows, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The creature prowled outside, its heavy footsteps circling the cabin. Occasionally, they'd hear it tap or scrape against the walls, testing their defenses. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice shaking. "Not yet," Michael said. "We wait until it's gone." Hours passed. The creature's sounds faded, but none of them dared to leave the cabin. When dawn broke, the forest was eerily quiet again. "This is our chance," Michael said. They grabbed what they could and made a dash for their car. The walk back to the dirt road where they'd parked felt endless, every rustling leaf sending their hearts racing. The tracks they'd seen before were everywhere now, crisscrossing the trail. Then, just as they reached the car, the creature appeared again, standing at the edge of the woods. In the daylight, it was even more terrifying. Its sheer size and presence almost supernatural. It didn't move, just watched as they scrambled into the vehicle and sped away. None of them spoke until they reached the nearest town. Even then, the words felt inadequate. Whatever they'd seen, it wasn't something they wanted to explain, or could explain. Michael returned to Wichita with a newfound appreciation for the safety of concrete and steel. But he couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes watching from the woods, a reminder that some things are better left unknown. The road trip was supposed to be a chance for Sylvester Stallone and his friends to unwind. It was early October, and the colors of Michigan's forests were in full display, leaves crunching underfoot and the wind carrying the crisp bite of impending winter. They had decided to make a stop near a small town on the Upper Peninsula, a place known for its rustic charm and dense woods. Sylvester, a firefighter from Seattle, was always up for an adventure. His dog Max, a German Shepherd mix with an unflinching loyalty, sat in the backseat of the car, his head occasionally poking out to catch the scents on the wind. The group, 4 friends in total, was eager to explore the local trails and maybe build a fire to keep warm as the sun went down. Sylvester had always been a gym enthusiast, the kind of guy who could deadlift a car if the situation called for it, but even he was awed by the vastness of the forest here. It was a far cry from Seattle's bustling streets and rainy skies. That evening, they pulled off onto an old logging road, parking at a makeshift campsite deep in the woods. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves like whispers in a forgotten language. They set up their fire, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories. Sylvester had brought up a movie he'd once seen about the Rougarou, a creature of Native American folklore, said to be cursed, part man, part beast, with an insatiable hunger for human flesh. "Think we'll run into one out here?" joked Kyle, the group's self-appointed skeptic. "Not unless it's bulking season," Sylvester replied with a grin, patting his bicep. But the laughter died down quickly when Max started growling, his ears pinned back, his body rigid. "What's up with him?" asked Taylor, her voice tinged with unease. Sylvester looked into the shadows just beyond the firelight. "He's never like this." "Max is steady." Then came the noise, a low, guttural growl that seemed to echo all around them. The group froze. "What the hell was that?" whispered Hannah, her marshmallow slipping off the stick and into the fire. The growl came again, closer this time. Sylvester shone his flashlight toward the source, and the beam caught the glint of eyes. They were high off the ground, too high to belong to any ordinary animal, and the silhouette that emerged from the trees was massive. "It can't be." Sylvester muttered, his mind racing back to the stories of the Rougarou. The creature was described as humanoid, with elongated limbs, sharp claws, and an insidious hunger that drove it to stalk its prey relentlessly. The thing moved closer, stepping into the edge of the firelight. Its face was distorted, somewhere between human and wolf, its teeth bared in a snarl. Max barked furiously, straining against Sylvester's grip on his collar. "Everyone, back to the car!" Sylvester shouted. But before they could act, the creature lunged. Max broke free, leaping at the beast, giving the others just enough time to grab what they could and run. Sylvester's heart twisted as he heard Max yelp, a sound that cut through the chaos like a blade. They ran blindly through the forest, the wind whipping against their faces. The creature's growls echoed behind them, but its footsteps were eerily quiet, as though it floated just above the ground. "Keep moving!" Sylvester urged, his firefighter training kicking in. He led the group off the trail, ducking under low-hanging branches and weaving through the trees. The creature's sounds grew fainter, but they knew it wasn't gone. They found a hollow beneath a massive fallen tree and crawled inside, pressing themselves against the damp earth. The wind howled through the forest, masking the sounds of the creature's movements. They sat in silence, their breaths shallow, listening for any sign of pursuit. Sylvester's thoughts raced. He remembered his father, a man of few words but unshakable courage, teaching him the importance of staying calm under pressure. "Fear doesn't help," his father used to say. "It just gets in the way." But even his father hadn't faced anything like this. After what felt like hours, Sylvester decided it was time to move. "Stay quiet. Follow me," he whispered. They crept through the forest, using the wind to mask their movements. The creature was still out there. They could feel its presence like a shadow at their backs. At one point, they stumbled upon a torn piece of Max's collar, and Sylvester had to bite down hard to stifle his grief. Finally, they reached the main road. The headlights of an approaching truck were like a beacon of hope. They waved frantically, and the driver, an older man with a weathered face, pulled over. "What's wrong?" he asked, his eyes widening as he saw their state. "Just drive," Sylvester said, his voice hoarse. As the truck sped away, Sylvester looked back at the forest. For a brief moment, he thought he saw the creature standing at the tree line, its glowing eyes watching them leave. The group made it to the nearest town, shaken but alive. Sylvester never found Max, a loss that weighed on him heavily. The others tried to convince him to talk to the police, but he knew they wouldn't believe him. In the weeks that followed, Sylvester couldn't shake the feeling that the creature was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And every time the wind howled through the trees, he swore he could hear that guttural growl, a reminder that some stories aren't just stories. It was one of those bright winter days when the sun seemed more for show than warmth, casting a stark light over Montana's snow-draped landscapes. I had never been to this part of the country before, and its vastness felt different than Chicago. Back home, the streets were hemmed in by skyscrapers, the skyline cutting into the horizon. Out here, the horizon was endless, stretching into white plains and dark silhouettes of pines, their tops dusted with snow. The chill in the air wasn't softened by the sunshine. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. The trip wasn't my idea. My friend Eric, the kind of guy who never stopped talking about the untouched wilderness, had insisted we go for a road trip to reconnect with nature. Melissa and Jamie had tagged along too, for reasons I couldn't fathom. None of us were outdoorsy, but Eric's enthusiasm had a way of dragging people along. We'd spent the morning driving through narrow back roads, the car tires crunching on patches of ice and gravel. Around noon, Eric suggested we stop in a wooded area off the highway to stretch our legs. "You're gonna love it," he said. Quiet, peaceful, no honking horns or smog. The trees were tall, their branches heavy with snow. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that danced as the wind whispered through the forest. We built a small fire near the edge of a clearing to stave off the biting cold. The flames crackled, sending thin spirals of smoke into the air. I kept myself busy checking the car, making sure it was ready for the drive back. Cars were my thing. I spent most of my free time back in Chicago fixing up old models in my garage. There was something comforting about the straightforwardness of an engine, the way every piece fit together with a purpose. It was a simplicity you didn't find often in people. While I worked, I caught snippets of the others' conversation. They were talking about the wildlife out here, bears, elk, wolves. I wasn't too worried. We had a couple of knives, and Eric had brought a flare gun just in case. The first sign that something was wrong came from Jamie, who had wandered a bit farther into the trees. "Guys," she called, her voice uncertain, "come here, you have to see this." We walked over, our boots crunching in the snow. Jamie was standing near a large tree, pointing at the ground. There in the snow were tracks. They were huge. They were huge, larger than any wolf or bear I'd ever heard of. The shape was wrong, too, more like an elongated hand with claw marks digging deep into the frost. "What the hell?" Melissa muttered, glancing nervously at the woods around us. Eric crouched down, his face lit with curiosity. "It's probably just some animal, maybe a deformity or something." But even he didn't sound convinced. The forest seemed quieter now. The wind had died down, and the usual sounds of wildlife, birds chirping, branches creaking, were absent. It was as if the whole place was holding its breath. Then I saw it. Sitting behind a tree just far enough that the shadows obscured most of its form was something. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it shifted slightly, and I saw its eyes. They gleamed in the sunlight, unnervingly human, but set in a face that was anything but. Its body was massive, covered in dark fur that blended with the tree bark. It wasn't moving, just sitting there, staring at us. Eric?" I said, my voice low. "You seeing this?" Eric turned, and his face went pale. "What is that?" Melissa whispered. No one answered. For a moment, we all just stood there, frozen. Then the thing rose. It didn't stand so much as unfold itself, its limbs unnaturally long, its movements eerily fluid. Jamie screamed, and that was all it took. The creature lunged, and we ran. I heard the sound of its pursuit, the crunch of snow, the snapping of branches. It was fast, too fast for something its size. We bolted through the forest, dodging trees and stumbling over roots hidden beneath the snow. Jamie was ahead of me, but Melissa tripped and fell, her scream piercing the air. I stopped, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet. "Keep going," I shouted. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the forest, where the trees thinned, giving way to a small village. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sight of it was like a lifeline. We staggered into the nearest building, a general store. The man behind the counter looked up, startled by our appearance. "Something's in the woods," I gasped, my breath fogging in the cold air. We didn't call the police. What could we say? That a monster was chasing us? But we stayed in that village until a truck heading back toward the highway gave us a ride. I don't know what we saw that day. None of us talked about it on the drive home. But every so often I think back to those eyes glinting in the shadows, and I wonder if it's still out there, watching, waiting.